In the year 1625, an Italian nobleman named Pietro della Valle went on a tour of the Middle East. Della Valle was a prolific traveler. He journeyed around Asia, North Africa, and even India. He married an Assyrian Christian princess in Damascus, and now the two of them traveled together, journeying by horseback and camel, accompanied by local guides. At this time, travel in this region couldn't have been more dangerous. The Ottoman and Persian empires were at war, fighting over who would rule in Baghdad. And meanwhile, local bandits took advantage of the chaos to prey on travelers. In those days, lions even roamed in these hills. Due to these various dangers, Della Valle's guides were constantly on edge. It was June the 18th, 1625, when they spotted a distant group of tribesmen on the horizon. Their guides decided that they might be in danger and began to search for a place to hide. In the distance, they spotted the looming mass of a series of enormous ruins, as Della Valle later wrote in his memoirs.
Being suspicious of some Arabian vagrant or vagabonds, for more security we removed a mile further and took up our station under a little hill near some ruins of buildings, which we saw from far away.
Della Valle's group stayed in those ruins for several nights, while their guides negotiated with the local ruler, asking for safe passage. During the day, under the baking Iraqi sun, Della Valle passed his time by walking among those monumental ruins.
Our removal hence being still deferred, I went in the forenoon to take a more diligent view of the ruins of the above said ancient building. What it had been I could not understand, but I had found it to have been built with very good bricks, most of which were stamped with certain unknown letters which appeared very ancient. I observed that they had been cemented together not with lime, but with bitumen or pitch.
Della Valle was fascinated by the broken fragments of writing that littered the ground of this ruined place. He explored further and wrote down some of the symbols that he saw again and again, stamped into the stones and pieces of clay brick.
Surveying the ruins again, I found on the ground some pieces of black marble, hard and fine, engraven with the same letters as the bricks, which seemed to me to be a kind of seal. Amongst other symbols which I discovered in that short time, two I found in many places. One was like a pyramid, and the other resembled a star of 8 points.
Della Valle and his wife didn't know it, but they had stumbled across the ruins of Ur, a city that had formed the center of one of mankind's first civilizations. This society was known as Sumer, and it was where so much of the world we know today first began. Eventually, negotiations with the local leader fell apart, and Della Valle's guides no longer felt safe camped out there in the ruins. They departed in the dead of night and fled to safety across the desert. In Della Valle's bags were a few of the clay tablets that he had found scattered around the ruins of Ur. These would be the first examples ever seen in Europe of a language that had been dead and forgotten for thousands of years. All the way home, Della Valle must have turned those tablets over in his hands, gazed at their mysterious ancient symbols. He must have wondered to himself, who had built those enormous mounds of brick and earth, all alone out there in the middle of the desert? What did the symbols on those broken pieces of clay mean? And if such a great city had once stood there, what in all the world could have happened to it? My name's Paul Cooper, and you're listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. Each episode, I look at a civilization of the past that rose to glory and then collapsed into the ashes of history. I want to ask, what did they have in common? What led to their fall? And what did it feel like to be a person alive at the time who witnessed the end of their world? In this episode, I want to go back to the very beginning and look at a society that is one of the candidates for the first ever technological human civilization. These are the people of Sumer, who we call the Sumerians. I want to show how, over the course of millennia, the Sumerians would build a society that would form the blueprint for all that followed after. I want to show how they rose to invent writing, mathematics, and the wheel, and built the largest cities that humanity had ever seen. And I want to explore what happened to cause their final and devastating collapse. In the highlands of southeastern Turkey, a range of snow-topped limestone peaks rise over 3,000 meters above the flat plains beneath. These are the Taurus Mountains. The mountains of Turkey rise so sharply that rain clouds find it difficult to pass over them. Instead, these clouds pool in their hollows and valleys and give these hills an exceptionally high rate of annual rainfall. In spring and summer, the warm air means that the clouds are even denser, and violent thunderstorms rock these mountains too, echoing off the stones of the valleys. As a result, this is a landscape shaped by water. The steep sides of the Taurus Mountains have been eroded to form streams and waterfalls, while underground rivers have cut into the rock and hollowed out some of the largest caves in Asia. Just as it has shaped the rocks, water has also shaped the beliefs of this region's people. The name of these mountains, Taurus, comes from the Latin word for bull, and the reason for this isn't hard to see. Temples have been unearthed all across these mountains, decorated with terracotta statues of bulls. Since ancient times, the people who lived here worshipped the storm god Teshub. They believed he rode on the back of a bull, perhaps because the sound of the thunderstorms reminded them of the thumping of enormous hooves. Accompanied with the cracking and booming of these thunderstorms, these heavy spring rains drain into streams and join rivers already flowing down from the snowy mountain passes of Armenia. Soon, these small rivers join together and flow down from the mountains and out onto the wide, flat plains beneath in two great, majestic watercourses that run together in near parallel for nearly 2,000 kilometers. The vast floodplain of these rivers is today the land we call Iraq. In Arabic, this area is called Bilad el-Rafide, the land of the two rivers. And in the West, it has been known since ancient times by its Greek name, combining the words Mesos, or middle, and Potamos, or river. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. These two great waterways are known as the Tigris and the Euphrates. For millennia, these rivers have brought life down into the flat floodplain of Iraq, and the source of that life comes from some of the most lifeless things, the rocks of the mountains themselves. Virtually all rocks are held together with tiny flecks of two different materials, called quartz and feldspar. Quartz is a clear, glittering crystal formed from oxygen and silicon, while feldspar is a complex mineral derived from silicon. Together, they make up over 60% of the Earth's crust. And when rivers cut their roots through the mountain gullies and underground streams, their waters wash over the rocks and dissolve their soluble parts. But quartz and feldspar don't dissolve in water, and so these tiny crystals are carried along by the river in a cloud of glittering particles. We call this substance silt. Silt is sometimes known by the more poetic name rock flour, and its particles are smaller than a grain of sand. But these tiny specks can have an enormous impact. Soil with a high silt content tends to hold water better and promotes air circulation. And for this reason, silty soil forms the perfect habitat for most plants. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates transport vast amounts of silt down into the lowlands of Iraq every year. And as a consequence, this flat stretch of otherwise arid desert has become exceptionally fertile. For the history of this region and the history of all humanity, these tiny particles would prove immensely significant. Other than its rich clay soil, the desert plains of southern Iraq are an inhospitable landscape. In fact, this is perhaps the last place you might expect the first human civilizations to arise. For one thing, the climate of this region is extremely hot and dry. Summer temperatures can reach over 52 degrees centigrade or 126 degrees Fahrenheit. And rainfall is rare, especially in summer. Coupled with the strong winds that blow across these plains, this means that the soil is arid and windswept. And although the seasonal flooding of the rivers brings life to the earth, these floods are also unpredictable. In Egypt, the River Nile flows directly from the Great Lakes of Africa, which act as a stabilizing and regulating force. But the Tigris and Euphrates depend on the amount of rain that fell on the mountains of Turkey, Armenia, and Kurdistan, a quantity that varies greatly from year to year. Years of drought can often be followed by years of devastating floods. And during winter, the whole plain is covered with a thick layer of mud. The region of southern Iraq is also poor in natural resources. The land is essentially nothing but a floodplain made of clay and silt. There are no metals to be mined here, and virtually no stone. And because of all these challenges, it took early humans a long time to reach this hostile environment. In the far prehistoric, archaic humans like Homo erectus vied for survival in the upper reaches of the rivers. Archaeologists have found stone axes and other artifacts dating back to nearly 500,000 years ago. But the riverlands of southern Iraq weren't suitable for this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But about 13,000 years ago, things began to change. The first nomadic hunter-gatherers began to settle down in permanent villages. These early innovators had noticed something interesting. They saw that when they threw away the discarded seeds of edible plants, that same plant would later sprout out of their rubbish dumps. And this gave them an idea. They realized that if you buried plant seeds in the earth, fed them and watered them, more of the same plants would grow. These were some of the first farmers, and once they found a good patch of land, they quite understandably didn't want to move. They soon built houses nearby, and storehouses to keep food through the winter. They banded together into larger communities in order to divide the labor of farming and to protect their grain should anyone else try to take it. They learned how to take the clay from the ground and shape it into pots. But they were still limited to areas where the rains were plentiful, to the mountains and the foothills. From about the year 6500 BC, these human settlements began to spread. Century by century, millennium by millennium, they worked their way down the courses of the two great rivers and into the inhospitable land of southern Iraq. Who these people were, what language they spoke, and what they called themselves, we have no idea. Today, we call this stretch of several thousand years the Ubaid period, named quite arbitrarily after the site where their first artifacts were found. As the Ubaid people moved down the rivers of Iraq, they began to notice other things too. They noticed that date palms grew in some areas of the river, providing them with a rich and delicious source of calories. They soon found out that these too could be cultivated and planted in orchards. And they also noticed that these palms could provide shade for other more fragile plants, allowing them to be grown too beneath the harsh Iraqi sun. And they made another crucial discovery too. They realized that they didn't have to grow their plants only on the banks of the river. With a bit of hard work, they could dig channels that diverted the life-giving water inland. Now they could grow crops just about anywhere, so long as you could dig a canal long enough. And the people of this region would soon become very good at digging canals. Worked properly in this manner, this landscape could be immensely productive. In their fields, the people here grew wheat, millet and sesame, and in gardens beneath the shade of their date palms, they also grew pomegranates, grapes and figs, as well as chickpeas, lentils, leeks, garlic, cucumbers and watercress. But there was one noticeable patch of green in the midst of all this desert. In the south of Iraq, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates branched into deltas and shallow lakes before they meet the ocean, creating an ancient marsh landscape. Here, dense thickets of reeds grow, so tall you can't see over the tops of them, populated with buffalo, wild boar, and marshland birds. Since ancient times, the people here have built their houses out of reeds, binding them together into incredibly strong beams of up to a meter thick, and building large, vaulted houses out of nothing but reeds. And it's in this marshy southern landscape that the greatest Sumerian cities rose. Just as Mesopotamia was watered by two great rivers, its lands were also populated by two great peoples. These were the people of Sumer and the people of Akkad. Over the course of their history, the Sumerians and the Akkadians grew together in such a symbiotic way that it's impossible to tell the story of one without the other. We know a decent amount about the Akkadian people in the north. They spoke a language in the Semitic family, meaning that it's in the same language family as the Aramaic of the Bible, and later Hebrew and Arabic. This language seems to have been indigenous to the region, and it shares grammar and words with many other languages that surrounded it. But the Sumerian people are much more mysterious. In fact, they are such a mystery that they have caused archaeologists to refer to what's called the Sumerian problem. Sumerians spoke what we call a language isolate. That is, it has no relation to any of the languages around it, and it's essentially in a language family all of its own. Sumerian was so alien to the region that early scholars who discovered its first texts didn't believe it could be a real language at all. They thought it must have been a kind of code used to communicate in secret. This alone has led some historians to ask whether the Sumerians may have arrived in southern Iraq from somewhere else. The Sumerian culture centered on the sea coast of Iraq's far south, and so some have suggested that they may have arrived by boat. Some backing for this theory may come in the writings of Roman historian Flavius Josephus, who wrote down a Babylonian legend that he heard in the 1st century AD. It relates the story of a half-man, half-fish called Oannes, who walked out of the sea and taught the people of Mesopotamia the secrets of culture.
He brought them the knowledge of letters, sciences, and all kinds of techniques. He also taught them how to found cities, build temples, create laws, and measure plots of land. He revealed to them how to work the land and gather fruits.
After teaching mankind all these secrets, Oannes leaps back into the sea and swims away. It's possible that in this myth, ancient storytellers have preserved some memory of the arrival of the Sumerians, landing en masse by boat, and bringing with them their advanced urban culture. Some have even argued that the Sumerians may have come from as far afield as India. And more evidence for the migration theory seems to come from the words that the Sumerians used for their professions. For more common jobs, the ones that involved manual labor, the Sumerians used old, pre-Sumerian words. Meanwhile, they brought new words with them to describe more sophisticated and urban occupations. For instance, the words for scribe and winemaker are both distinctly Sumerian. But others have proposed a more interesting theory, which does seem to solve some of these contradictions. Although it does seem a little far-fetched, I think it is worth mentioning here. The clue to this theory comes, once again, from mythology. The Sumerian version of history was dominated by a devastating event of apocalyptic proportions. And if you were brought up reading Bible stories, you may find it familiar. The Sumerians believed that in a time long before, in the time of their most distant ancestors, a great flood had washed over the world. This same story would later pass on into the legends of the Babylonian Empire, and from there to the Hebrew poets who wrote the first books of the Bible. For this reason, the story of the flood is perhaps the oldest continuously told story, and it's in this legend that the clue to the origin of the Sumerians might lie. The story of the flood is so striking that many historians with varying degrees of credibility have tried to come up with some historical event that may have inspired it. And history is actually full of great inundations. When the last ice age ended around 10,000 BC, global temperatures rose between 4 to 7 degrees over a period of about 5,000 years. Up until that point, vast ice sheets had covered the land in the north of the planet, reaching as far south as Berlin. But as temperatures rose, these ice caps melted, and their water poured back into the oceans. Global sea levels rose an average of 2.5 centimeters a year, until by the end, the sea had risen an incredible 120 meters, or enough to completely swallow a 30-story building. Around the world, the sea engulfed vast regions of the coast. The land bridge that had once connected Russia and Alaska was submerged, separating Asia and the Americas forever. Low-lying regions of what is now Europe's North Sea flooded, turning Great Britain into an island. And in the Middle East, the effects were felt just as dramatically. During the low sea levels of the Ice Age, the Tigris and Euphrates had flowed for a further 600 kilometers, joining into a single river and meandering along a stretch of low-lying valley wedged between what is now Iran and Saudi Arabia. This grand river would have met the Indian Ocean around the region of Dubai today. Some historians have argued that Neolithic humans may have made their home in this fertile valley, having journeyed down from the mountains of Iran. But as the glaciers melted, the sea advanced, slowly at first, but with an increasing speed. Over the next 5,000 years, the coastline would have moved an average rate of 120 meters a year. That's over a kilometer every 10 years, or 1 meter every 3 days.
Thanks. How much time is it? Oh man, that was like 12 minutes ago. Sorry, man. Jeez, that was like 12 minutes. Sorry, dude. That was a long time ago.
The next centuries would see
We shaved, we brushed our teeth. This is the degenerate stream.
which swallowed whole forests and villages. These people would have been pressed into ever denser populations, forced to adapt as they went.
No problem. You're nice, man.
They
Nice,
would have
dude.
been a roving band of refugees.
Thanks, man. How you doing, bro?
Never able to settle anywhere for long before the sea made its next advance.
I want to make my stream like look nicer. It's degenerate stream, yeah. I want to make like my stream look nicer, the chat box and everything. I'll do it next time, I think. Make it really like nice and
Right around
sleek.
the year 5000 BC, just at the time
I also
Sumerian culture
look really what's the word?
burst onto the historical stage.
Scruffy.
So this
I was watching my
theory
stream yesterday, man. I
roughly
did not
deserves
look
some consideration.
like I was not
That
an
as the
attractive
waves
human
of
being
Semitic-speaking
in my stream
farmers
yesterday.
moved down the rivers
Just
of
the intensity
mountains to the
of
north,
this level, I think,
they met another population
and the lack of
coming
like
up
hair
from the
gel. And
south.
I
A
just
ravaged,
don't look like a fucking.
devastated people, speaking a
I
language
don't want to talk about
that
like vanity,
evolved
but
independently
just sitting there and looking
and
at
telling
myself, I was like,
tales
damn,
of a flood
that is
that had
not.
drowned the whole world.
I'm like, my soul is not that ugly.
This theory could be supported by that
I
legend.
don't know what it is. Like I gotta
Phileas
gel my hair when I
Fishman
stream or
Atlantis.
something. I don't know.
Is it possible
Maybe
that
my
the
camera
Sumerians
angle.
came to
Maybe I gotta
southern
angle
Iran,
it up instead of
not by
down. Who
boat,
knows?
but actually
I gotta check. I gotta figure it
walking
out.
onto a land that was now at the
Just
bottom
everything's
of
not
the
right.
sea.
It could be better.
Another legend, called the myth of Enki and Ninursag, relates a creation story in which the god Enki creates man in a land called Dilmun.
You didn't know? No worries, man. Thanks, man.
Like
Thanks,
the
buddy. No
Garden of
stress. No,
Eden,
no. Yeah. Hey, I
Dilmun
appreciate that, man.
is an earthly paradise.
Just the. I don't know.
In Dilmun, the crow does not utter its
I guess
cry.
it's such a brutal
The lion
level.
does not kill.
The main goal,
wolf
I
does
guess,
not
goal
seize
night
the
is just so
lamb.
brutal. The main
The
goal
wild
is to
dog,
freaking
devourer
get the
of
time.
kids, is unknown.
Whatever.
Dilmun
I don't know what I'm talking
is
about.
thought to have been what is now
Thanks, man. Thanks for being here, dude.
an island
Appreciate that, man.
in the middle of the Persian Gulf, that body of water that was once a fertile river valley. All we have on this subject is speculation, and until any further evidence is found, this will remain just a theory. But as a storyteller, I can't help but be drawn
Yo, what's up,
to this
Christian? How you doing,
colourful
man? Thanks for being here,
explanation.
man.
When we try to work out the truth of what happened in this incredibly distant past, we are reminded
insane.
that history is not a rigid set
Legend.
of dates and facts, but a continuing process of
That's
inquiry
insane, bro.
and debate.
Congrats, make the money.
It can sometimes feel like mapping
Make
the surface
that
of a planet in
money.
another solar system, or like exploring the dark depths of the deep sea. And all we have to work with are the small spots of light that history provides.
So tired, all I hear you, man. Congrats, dude.
We may never know the truth about where the Sumerians came from,
Congrats,
but there
man.
is plenty that we do know. The Sumerians referred to themselves as Uksaggiga, or the black-headed people, and the Akkadians called them Salmat Akkadi, which meant the same thing in their own language. From carvings that depict Sumerians, we can see how they wore their hair, curly on top and cut short on the sides. Common men wore sheepskin kilts, while the richer people would have worn coloured fabrics spun from wool, decorated with tassels and beads. Among the wealthy, both men and women wore jewellery, anklets, bracelets, necklaces and ear ornaments made of copper and sometimes
Really sorry to hear
gold.
that. I'm a lazy guy. I'm a lazy worker.
Remarkably, we also
So I'm
have
really
a
sorry to hear
great
that.
deal of evidence about Sumerian music. Like everything else, the Sumerians wrote their music down on clay tablets. And we've also discovered other texts that
very
explain
lazy.
how to play it, including how to tune the instruments. And so today,
I'm a very
we're
lazy
able to
worker.
hear the sounds of the music that once played in the temples and courtyards of cities like
Jimmy.
Eridu, Ur, and Uruk.
Off tomorrow. You work
These
tonight? Oh
two
wow,
great
insane.
peoples, the Semitic Akkadians,
Proud of you, man.
and
Congratulations, dude.
Sumerians, formed a symbiosis over the next centuries that would see their cultures run in parallel, just like their two great rivers. They shared their successes and advances. They shared the cities that were even now growing to become the largest ever seen. But they also shared their failures. And as a result, their fates became inextricably intertwined. The Sumerians believed that the world was a roughly circular landmass, surrounded on all sides by a huge body of water. They believed that another ocean also lay above their heads, held in place by the solid structure of the sky,
Why?
which occasionally let some of this water through as rain.
Oh man.
They divided water
Good
into
first
two
run.
types, that of the rain and rivers, sweet water, and that of the sea, bitter water. Sumerians called their homeland Ki Engir, which means the land of the noble lords. To describe the settled societies of the Sumerians and Akkadians, they used the word kalam, meaning civilized, while they used the word kur to describe the mountainous zones bordering the plains. Kur in the Sumerian language meant mountain, but it also came to mean rebellious, barbarous, and wild.
Why?
And at this time, that's how the outside world must have looked to them. To their south and west, the vast desert of Arabia yawned, a rolling sea of sand dunes where nothing grew, home to fierce nomadic tribes.
Ah,
the
it
rocky
ate my
Taurus
shooting
mountains of
input.
Turkey
Why?
and
Why would it
Kurdistan
do that?
hemmed them in,
It's just so dumb.
full of hardy mountain people, while the Zagros mountains
Oh,
of Iran formed the edge of their world to the east. Today, the Arabic word for the region of Upper Mesopotamia still holds within it a sense of this feeling of isolation. They call it El Jazira, meaning the island. But despite the challenges of their landscape, the Sumerians flourished. They had no stone to build with, so instead they learned to make bricks from the river mud, mixing them with straw, gravel, and broken pottery, baking them. With clay, they made everything from pots and plates to sickles and writing tablets. They had no wood, so instead they harvested vast numbers of reeds, tying them together into bundles and plaiting them together into mats. The Sumerians invented or adopted the pottery wheel, the wagon wheel, the plough, and the sailboat. Their buildings used complex arches and domes.
It's
They
too
worked
dumb.
out how to cast metals,
It's just
such
too
as
dumb.
copper and later bronze. And the Sumerians were also avid mathematicians. They developed complex systems of measurement,
It's really
as well
slow.
as methods for dividing,
That was extremely
multiplying,
slow.
and calculating angles, even writing down the first ever multiplication tables on clay tablets. We actually use Sumerian mathematics every day. It was the Sumerians who divided time into the minutes and seconds we still use. And since their number system worked on a base of 60, rather than our system of 10, that's why we have 60 minutes in an hour. The reason for using 60 as the base of a number system is actually quite simple, and it's rooted in the design of our bodies. If you hold your hand out in front of you right now, you'll notice that each of your 4 fingers is divided into 3 segments. It's thought that ancient people would use the thumb of their right hand to tap each segment of the finger, counting up to 12. When they reached 12, they would raise a finger on their left hand, counting up the 12s. And when you had 5 fingers raised on your left hand, you had 60, and you had to start again. The fact that there were 12 cycles of the moon in each year would have confirmed for the Sumerians that this was the number system intended by the gods. The 360 degrees we still use in angle measurement is another relic of this system. Due to this spark of ingenuity, Sumerian society grew at a slow but steady pace. They dug vast networks of irrigation canals that extended the agricultural zone around the rivers and also allowed them to transport goods in canal boats. They built dams to regulate the flow of the rivers and ensure that the spring floods came in a more controlled way. In fact, the Sumerian language has a vast array of words to describe the different kinds of canals, reservoirs, dams, and lock gates required to control their water. Gradually, the landscape of southern Iraq transformed from dusty salt flats and marshy swamps to a green patchwork of farmland. Many historians have argued that it was the digging of these canals and watercourses that originally led to the greater social organization we see during the Sumerian period. These extensive systems of water management needed careful planning, engineering expertise, and mathematical calculations. Work teams needed to be organized and paid in food and beer. Foremen and overseers needed to be appointed. And all of this led to a kind of early bureaucracy that gave rise to the first true states. In the 1930s, historian Arnold Toynbee famously argued that it was just these environmental challenges in southern Iraq that created the conditions in which civilization could be created.
The desiccation of the region impelled the fathers of the Sumeric civilization to come to grips with the jungle swamp of the lower valley of Tigris and Euphrates and to transform it. The ordeal through which the fathers of the Sumeric civilization passed is commemorated in Sumeric legend. The slaying of the dragon Tiamat by the god Marduk and the creation of the world out of her mortal remains signifies the subjugation of the primeval wilderness and the creation of the land by the canalization of the waters and the draining of the soil.
The tough semi-desert landscape created what he called a stimulus and response effect in these early people. Toynbee argues that in conditions that are too comfortable, people have little need of increased social organization or technological development. And in conditions that are too harsh, society finds it impossible to develop.
It's just too fucking
He argues that it's in environments such as southern Iraq, where the challenges are numerous but not overwhelming, that a cradle of civilization can occur. According to Sumerian texts, the first city in the region was the city of Eridu. One controversial document known as the Sumerian King List describes Eridu as the place where the god Enki first decided that a king should rule.
When kingship from heaven was lowered, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alalim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alangar ruled for 36,000 years.
For obvious reasons, many historians have questioned the reliability of this source. Some have even gone so far as to call it a piece of utter fiction, or a later piece of propaganda, designed to legitimize a usurper to the throne. But the King List does tell us how the Sumerians, of at least one point, thought of their history. And many have argued that Eridu may well have been the world's first city. Eridu was founded around the year 5400 BC. That's nearly 7.5 millennia ago. At this time, populations of woolly mammoths, survivors of the end of the Ice Age, still roamed in remote parts of the world. Eridu was populated by Sumerian speakers, and soon it would make up just one of a whole constellation of small cities that dotted the landscape of southern Iraq. These independent city-states were centered around their temples and ruled by priest kings known as the Ensi. Records show that these Ensi were often assisted by a council of elders, which included both men and women. Most of the largest cities in this period were probably no bigger than about 10,000 people. The borders of these city-states were defined by the courses of canals and specially created boundary stones, carved monuments left jutting out of the earth to mark the line between one territory and another. Slowly, these cities began to eclipse the old Ubaid culture that had preceded them. Art and architecture began to take on the form that we would truly call Sumerian, and technology also began to take huge leaps forward. This first period seems to have been a time of relative peace. There's little evidence of organized warfare or the keeping of professional soldiers in these early cities. Most towns during this period went without walls. One exceptionally ancient Sumerian myth, called the Gifts of Inanna, seems to capture some of the spirit of this period of transition. It describes technology and the refinements of civilization being handed down by Enki, the king of the gods, to his daughter, the goddess Inanna. She later passes them down to the people of Sumer.
Holy Inanna received the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the coppersmith, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the reed worker. Holy Inanna received wisdom, the shepherd's hut, the knowledge to pile up glowing charcoals, the sheepfold.
Enki teaches Inanna about family, the proper laws of inheritance, and the art of good judgment. But he also goes on to give her other gifts, some of which show that the darker side of civilization was already beginning to make itself known.
Holy Inanna received deceit and the rebel lands. Holy Inanna received heroism, power, wickedness, the plundering of cities, and the making of lamentations.
It may be that the ancient Sumerians already recognized, right at the dawn of settled human society, what the scholar Walter Benjamin would one day write, that there is no record of civilization that is not at the same time a record of barbarism. And it's true that during this period, the Sumerians began practices that would begin a sorrowful phase of human history. Among them is the use of slave labor. They captured men and women from the hill countries outside their borders and used their labor to fuel the growth of their own economy. In the last episode, I used the metaphor of the death of stars to talk about the life cycle that empires often pass through. But we might also think about the birth of civilizations in this way. The first stars were born from gas clouds, compacted together under the weight of their own gravity into a spinning ball of matter. Under enough pressure, the temperature of the star's core increased, and finally, nuclear fusion began. The first stars burst into light. When enough people gather together in one place, that settlement obtains a kind of gravity. It draws other people towards it, and as the size of the settlement increases, so does pressure on its various systems. In some cases, this pressure results in those people being fused together into more complex forms of organization. Sometime around the year 3200 BC, the first stars of these human settlements began to burst into light, and that light was the invention of writing. One Sumerian epic poem, called Enmarkar and the Lord of Arata, gives the first known story about the invention of writing. This poem attributes the invention to a king who has to send so many messages that his messenger can't remember them all.
Because the messenger's mouth was heavy and he couldn't repeat the message, the Lord of Kalaba patted some clay and put words on it like a tablet. Until then, there had been no written words of clay.
The Sumerians had two things around them in virtually limitless abundance. That's the clay beneath their feet and the reeds that grew in the marshes and along the banks of the rivers. And it's these two resources that combined to form the first human writing. Sumerian scribes would pick up a lump of clay big enough to fit in their hand. In fact, about the size of a modern smartphone. They would take a piece of reed, cut into the shape of a wedge, and print it over and over into the clay to form symbols. The distinctive wedge shapes of the reeds give this form of writing its name. We call it cuneiform. The oldest cuneiform clay tablets come from the city of Uruk and date to the late 4th millennium, probably around the 32nd or 31st centuries. This script originally consisted of pictographs, small pictures designed to depict objects, so everyone could understand what they represented. These were first used to keep track of everyday things like rations and supplies. And on some of these very early tablets, you can still see very clearly what they mean. A bowl of food is depicted with an eating mouth next to 6 impressions, and a sheaf of wheat next to 5. This indicates that a worker can exchange this tablet for 6 bowls of food and 5 sheaves of wheat. Scribes would have had to work fast, copying hundreds of documents throughout their day, and slowly this pressure meant that the signs had to become simpler and more abstract. Before long, they no longer looked like the objects they described. After the year 3000, the number of symbols was reduced from around 1500 to about 600. And someone else had the bright idea that each symbol could stand for a certain sound, instead of a whole idea. This was the beginning of the first alphabet. But it meant that now only an educated few could understand writing. And soon a separate class of scribes emerged. The human brain would never be the same again. People could now read the words of kings and scribes who had died hundreds of years before, and they could also begin to write down everything they had learned so it could be remembered, and more importantly, it could be built upon. Partly due to this ability to record knowledge, the technology of Sumer around this time began to take even greater leaps forward. This next period of history would be known as the period of Uruk. The period is named after the city of Uruk, which by the middle of the 4th millennium BC had grown into the largest and most powerful city in southern Mesopotamia. One of the key ways that historians mark the shift into the Uruk period is by observing a dramatic change that occurred around this time in the region's pottery. If you're thinking that the pottery must have got more sophisticated and ornate as technology improved, then you're mistaken. In fact, the ancient pottery of the Ubaid period was exceptionally beautiful. It was made on a device known as a slow wheel and painted with distinctive geometrical designs in brown or black. It was a luxury item for the select few. The shift to the Uruk period saw a great increase in the amount of pottery produced, but the quality fell dramatically. Thanks to a technology known as the fast wheel, clay jars and pots could now be made in great numbers by workmen in intensive workshops. This was the first era of mass production. The booming economy of the Sumerian cities comes to life in their documents. The clay tablets tell us that in the city of Girsu, for instance, 15,000 women were employed in the textile industry. One factory produced 1,100 tons of flour a year, as well as bread, beer, and linseed oil. This factory employed 134 specialists and 858 skilled workers, of which the vast majority were women. Since there was no currency at this time, workers were paid directly in food and other goods. The minimum ration of an unskilled factory worker consisted of 20 litres of barley a month.
Oh, brutal.
Along with 2
How was that
litres of
bad?
oil and
That was
2
really, really
kilos
bad.
of wool per year. Meanwhile, their supervisor would earn roughly twice this ration. The poor in Sumerian society were downtrodden and were probably pretty miserable. They often had to borrow.
It's wild how the Sumerians wrote all this
from
information down
predatory moneylenders at
about
crushing
wages and
interest
stuff.
rates of as high as 30%. But despite this rising inequality, by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, economic advancement meant that the city of Uruk had grown into the largest and most powerful city in southern Mesopotamia. This was around the year 3500 BC, or over 5,000 years ago. By this time, nearly 2,000 years had already passed since the original founding of the first city at Eridu. That's enough time to take us from the present moment to the age of Julius Caesar. By this time, Sumerian civilization
hell.
was already ancient. But the very earliest of the pyramids of Egypt would still not be built for another 900 years. In Britain, the Neolithic monument Stonehenge was at this time just a series of barrows and earthworks, and its large stones would not be moved into place for another 1,300 years. When writing was invented in Uruk in the 32nd century BC, the last population of woolly mammoths to survive the end of the Ice Age was still clinging to life on a rocky outcrop in the East Siberian Sea, known as Wrangel Island. By this time, Uruk would have had about 50,000 inhabitants. That's only enough to fill a modern, medium-sized football stadium, but at this time, it was the largest city that the Earth had ever seen. The world's earliest surviving piece of literature, known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, begins in this city. It is the story of a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh, who likely ruled sometime in the 3rd millennium. Whatever the historical facts of his reign are, Gilgamesh made enough of an impression as a ruler that he went down into legend as a mythical hero, 2/3 god and 1/3 man. And although there's much more myth than fact in this ancient tale, the Gilgamesh epic does tell us a little about how Sumerian society changed in the early centuries of the 3rd millennium. For one thing, it's clear that warfare had begun to increase in the region. The tale opens in the powerful city of Uruk, and one feature of the city is mentioned as a great source of pride. That's a ring of enormous fortified walls, as these lines from the Epic of Gilgamesh show.
Behold the outer walls which gleam like copper. See the inner wall which none can rival. Touch the threshold stone. It is from ancient days. Go up and walk on the wall of Uruk. Inspect the cornerstone and examine its brickwork. Is it not built of baked brick?
It's clear that city walls were now a necessity, but we can tell from the great pride shown in Uruk's fortifications that they may have also been quite rare. In fact, throughout the story, the city is referred to repeatedly as strong-walled Uruk. We also get a sense of how the city was divided during this time, suggesting some level of urban planning from its rulers.
These parts comprise Uruk. 1/3 for city, 1/3 for garden, 1/3 for field, and a precinct for the temple of Ishtar.
At the height of the Uruk period, the city covered an area of 2.5 square kilometers. It had a port on the river, along with workshops and cluttered houses. At the center of the city was Uruk's famous White Temple. It was elevated 21 meters and covered in white gypsum plaster that reflected the sunlight and would have caused the temple to glow during the day.
Why?
If you walked the streets of Uruk during this time, you would have seen
Guys, I think I need a new
markets full of
stick.
produce like beans and lentils,
Like, look at this.
pomegranates
It's really
and
bad.
dates, jars of date syrup and oil. In the richer parts of town, houses would be built from baked bricks, but elsewhere they would be mud and clay, dried in the sun. The houses would likely be arranged in a chaotic way, creating a labyrinth of alleys and warrens, covered by reed matting to keep them cool in the heat of the day. Farmers would be carrying large bundles.
This is
of
like
leaves
maybe a
on their
6,
backs,
maybe a
and
6
herders
out of
would
10.
bring their long-haired sheep
Might be a
and oxen
5.
into the city.
Man, it's
Here
like
and there,
disintegrated
you'd see men
in
sitting
my hands
circles
through
in
time
shaded
playing this level.
courtyards,
From a
sharing
10
a large jar of beer in
to
the
a
center,
5.
all sipping it through long straws
Wow.
made of hollow reeds. While the Sumerians did import some wines from the northern regions, it was beer that they loved most of all.
It was
They had
OEM,
over
I'm pretty
30
sure.
different varieties, with names
Got brand new
like
controllers
white,
somehow.
dark, cloudy, and sweetened with honey. Some of their beer was
Through my
flavored with
time of
herbs. It
acquiring
was brewed directly
N64
from the wheat
controllers
and
of my
barley
life.
of the fields, and if you bought the cheapest kind, it would often still have seeds of grain floating at the bottom. One cuneiform text has even preserved a kind of drinking song.
I will summon brewers and cupbearers to serve us floods of beer and pass it around. What pleasure, what delight, blissfully to take it in, to sing jubilantly of this noble liquor, our hearts enchanted and our souls radiant.
We can imagine the conversations that these ancient people would have had around their jars of beer. Probably not
What?
that
Why?
different to the conversations you'd find in any bar or pub today.
I can't believe how bad this stick
Some
is
of
now.
these everyday concerns
It's
have
crazy.
been preserved in lists of ancient Sumerian proverbs. These groups of beer drinkers would doubtless have complained that they were not appreciated at work.
I am a thoroughbred steed, but I am hitched to a mule, and must draw a cart and carry reeds and stubble.
Others would have commiserated about one of the oldest human concerns, not having enough money.
The poor man is better dead than alive. If he has bread, he has no soul. If he has soul, he has no bread.
Why?
And as with drinkers in all parts of history, they would have fallen out and shouted insults at each other in the streets.
Playing very poorly.
If you were put in water, the water would become foul. If you were put in a garden, the fruit would rot.
At night, people usually slept on their rooftops, since the heat inside the houses would have been too much for them. The city would have been a pungent mixture of smells.
Pardon me.
Pottery kilns and brickworks would have belched smoke throughout the day. There were no drainage systems in the roads, and people would have thrown their waste out into the street. In the houses, people laid down layers of clay, crushed gypsum dust, and reed mats to create a soft carpet-like effect. From the epicenter of this great metropolis, the Uruk civilization sent out ripples across the world, and eventually a number of similarly great cities rose up around it. But as the fourth millennium drew to a close, another Sumerian city was rising in power, and soon it would take Uruk's place as the new center of Sumerian culture. It would flourish into realms of untold wealth and push the boundaries of what humanity thought possible in the realms of art and architecture. It's the city whose ruins we opened this episode with, and the name of that city was Ur.
Can you imagine? Might as well try it.
Ur was situated right at the point where the Euphrates River met the sea. It was a trading port and fishing town, where seagulls would have circled and fishermen came in with their catches of fish, oysters, and turtles. Its position both on the sea and the river would have made it a booming hub of the region's trade. As we've already seen, if you needed clay or reeds, southern Iraq was the place to be. But for virtually
I think I've tried old
needed,
strat maybe,
Sumerians had to import
I don't know, 50 to 100 times through
but luckily for
time,
them,
just
they
for
always
fun.
had something to trade.
I don't think I
They
got
were
it
alone
once
among
that
almost all
the
the
fast way.
nations of the
That wasn't even
ancient
fast.
Middle East,
That's slower
in that
than
they produced a large surplus and variety
anyways.
of food.
I can't imagine doing that.
Archaeology
Because I
shows
can't.
that due to their
I can never spend enough
farming
time in front of the
abilities,
glass.
Mesopotamians of antiquity
The guards are always
enjoyed a far more rich and varied
they always
diet
react
than
really
their
quickly.
neighbors in either Turkey or Iran. We have even uncovered some ancient Sumerian recipes written down on clay tablets. This is the recipe for a dish they called tuhu, and it gives you a sense of the variety they enjoyed.
And then to survive after with all those
Get
guards
the water
there.
ready. Add fat, salt, beer, onion, rocket, coriander, semolina, cumin, and beetroot. Add them to the cooking pot. Then pound leek and garlic together and add. Let all blend and reduce to a pulp. Then sprinkle with coriander and carrot.
Boats full of wheat and grains, dried reeds and figs, were now forging up the rivers, bringing food to all the neighboring lands. And in return, other resources flowed back. Copper came down from the mountains of northwestern Iran, and later by ship from the island of Cyprus. Tin travelled through the long mountain passes from Afghanistan, as it would throughout the later Bronze Age. Silver came down the Euphrates on barges from Turkey's Taurus Mountains, while gold came overland from Egypt and by ship from India. Ordinary wood for everyday building could be chopped in the Zagros Mountains of Iran to the east, but for finer constructions, for palaces and ornate city gates, only the prized wood of the cedar tree would do. This was brought by ship from Lebanon, where it grew among the high mountain passes. In fact, one episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh relates the king's quest to slay a monster in the mountains of Lebanon and steal this beautiful wood from its forest.
No way. What?
The ancient Sumerians traded in what we would consider a truly globalized way.
Are you serious?
From their tiny coast on the Persian Gulf,
Anonymous
their ships
gifter to
sailed
Dogger?
around
That's
trading
legend.
ports in modern
Who is
Bahrain and
that?
Oman.
What?
And from there, they sailed along the
What?
coast
Dogger
to
with the
trade
emotes
with
to
another of the
Anonymous? Are you
world's most
serious,
ancient
Anonymous?
and
Thank you,
mysterious
Anonymous.
cultures.
What?
The people we know today as the
Wow, I'm
Indus
so...
Valley civilization. From there,
Dogger the
Sumerians
legend.
got all kinds of
Hell yeah.
spices and
Shout out Dogger.
gemstones
Go
like
follow
Marley,
Dogger.
as well
He
as the
streams
brilliant
GoldenEye.
blue lapis lazuli that the Sumerians adored.
He
They used it to make jewelry and amulets,
is world
inlays
record holder.
and gaming boards, musical
Nice guy.
instruments, and sculptures of astonishing beauty.
Good guy.
All
Yo,
of this trade
Anonymous,
was
thank you.
passed through Ur and
What?
swelled the city to a wealth that likely
Anonymous,
no other
insane.
human habitation had ever achieved.
If you want to remain
Grave
anonymous, that's
goods
cool.
uncovered in Ur show not only the incredible wealth
That's really
of its
cool.
rulers,
Thank you.
but
Whoever
also
that was.
magnificent craftsmanship that suggests an
It's
advanced community of artists.
It's an epic moment in time.
One such
From a
artifact,
screenshot on my phone.
found in a royal tomb in Ur, has given us an incredible
Epic
insight
moment, thank you.
into the lives and manners of the ancient Sumerians.
Nice, now Dogger can watch without
It's
ads.
an ornate, decorative
Nice.
piece of furniture, inlaid with a mosaic of shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli. And its images show detailed
Hell
scenes
yeah.
from everyday life
Heck yeah.
around 4,000
really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
years ago.
It's really nice.
Today,
I swear
it
I
is
do play
called
other
the
levels
standard
too.
of
I
Ur.
swear. I
On
was
one
thinking...
side, the
It's funny
artifact
it was
shows
Dogger because I
images
was
of
thinking
the
doing
Sumerians at
Archive
war,
16 with
the chariots
2.x.
pulled by donkeys,
I don't know how long that
the
will take to
soldiers
learn,
wearing
but
leather capes and helmets, the men carrying spears.
I already
and
learned a
axes.
bit of it from Damn.
On the other
Agent.
side, it depicts the Sumerians at peace. Farmers and herders working on one level, and above them, the scribes with their shaved heads sitting at their desks.
Thank you.
At this
That's
time,
really cool.
urbanism in the Sumerian world was reaching its peak. By the end of the third millennium, a majority of the region's population would live in cities. And in this newly urbanized world, the economic power of Ur remained king. Over the next centuries, its power expanded.
Yo,
and contracted.
what's up, Moonraker? How you
At
doing,
one
man?
point, some of its kings wrote inscriptions, calling themselves both the king of Ur and the king of Kish, another city that lay nearby.
What's
This
up, dude?
suggests
I'm gonna
that
clean up
Ur
my stream,
may
my
have
left side.
subdued some of its
That left
neighbors
bottom corner, I gotta
under its
clean it up.
political control.
I'm gonna make it better.
But by the mid-third millennium, it seems the influence of Ur began to wane.
Wow,
This
thank you. I
was a
appreciate that
new
so much.
militarized age, when the power of trade and diplomacy seems to have no longer been enough. And one city, called Lagash, truly came into its own in this era of violence.
That's legend.
Lagash was a slaving city. It had grown rich by raiding villages in the hills, kidnapping people and selling them across the region. Sometime around the year 2500
I think I gotta start gelling my hair before I
Lagash
start
fell
streaming.
out
I
with
look
its
like a
neighbor,
completely
a
different
city
person.
called Umma.
That sounds ridiculous. I know there's
The
people that
dispute
don't
seems to
have,
have been over a stretch of
hair,
farmland along the river,
and my
and
vanity
it
is,
caused the two
is
cities
ridiculous,
to go to
but
war. One carved stone
to be less
monument
scruffy.
from this time, known as a stele, captures something of the
feel really
spirit
scruffy.
of this age. It is known
Fine.
as the stele of the vultures. The upper part of the stone is normal enough. It shows the king of Lagash, a man named Eanatum, leading his soldiers into battle. They wear leather helmets and skirts made of reeds, shouldering their spears.
But like it
These
looks like I
spears would
just
have
woke
likely
up,
been topped with blades
and
of copper or
crawled out
bronze,
of bed, and that's
and would have
literally
flashed red in the
what
sun
happened.
as they marched. The king is riding ahead of them in an early chariot,
I shaved
wearing
and brushed my
animal
teeth,
skin
but
slung across his chest, with
I
a
ate,
spear and a
I
container
ate,
of
shaved,
javelins
brushed my
beside
teeth.
him.
Life is good.
When the armies met, the stele shows King Eanatum of Lagash dismounting from his chariot and proceeding to lead his men on foot. They advance in a phalanx, a tight square of men with broad shields protecting their fronts, and a porcupine
Why?
of short spears jutting out ahead. The fighting was bitter. Eanatum was struck in the eye by an arrow,
Thanks a lot.
but he lived on to see his army to victory. as the inscription on the stele recalls.
What?
Eonatum struck at Uma. The bodies were soon 3,600 in number. I, Eonatum, like a fierce storm wind, I unleashed the tempest.
I usually
As the
play
soldiers
better
of Uma tried to flee the bloody battlefield,
when I
the
put
stele
down my
shows
cup.
the soldiers of Lagash
What the fuck?
cutting them down and trampling them beneath their feet. There's something to this carving that to me embodies
brutal.
something of a
It's
change
just-
in the spirit of
just so
Sumerian warfare. It's a particular kind of nastiness that revels in the suffering
Oh
of
my
your
gosh.
enemies.
You
And
know,
this is shown most clearly in the part of the carving that gives it its name. These are the vultures flying
it's
overhead,
hard to reset.
carrying the severed heads of the soldiers of Uma in their beaks, picking at their tongues and eyes.
With the
It
natural
clearly
stuff.
shows a kind of massacre
It's a pain in the
perpetrated by the
ass.
city of Lagash, and it does so with relish. Due to military victories of this kind, the slaving city of Lagash went on to conquer much of southern Mesopotamia. Lagash established what some historians have called the
Thanks
first
so much for that
true
sub, that's really
empire in
cool.
the world.
It's really amazing.
But
Thank you
its
so
rule
much.
was short-lived. In these ancient times, administrating even one city was difficult. And the empire of Lagash, despite its military
Why?
success, was
I
soon
didn't name
critically
Haida.
overstretched. To make matters worse, King Eonatum seems to have ruled through what amounts to a campaign of terror. Unsurprisingly, his rule was unpopular, and revolts rose up against him. As the hated empire of Lagash fractured and collapsed, the ruler of one of
Not
its
high enough again.
suffocated cities seized his chance. He was the king of Uma, the city whose defeat and humiliation is depicted with such relish on the stele of the vultures. And his name was Lugal-Zaghazi. It's not clear exactly what made Lugal-Zaghazi so successful, but it's clear he was animated by an ardent desire for revenge against the empire of Lagash. Perhaps he had even been at the battle when King Eonatum had slaughtered thousands of his fellow citizens. He rose in rebellion against Lagash and quickly toppled kings that were still loyal to the empire in the cities of Kish and Larsa. Then he marched on the great city of Ur itself and the mighty walled fortress of Uruk. These both fell in turn, and the rebel Lugal-Zaghazi moved his capital to Uruk. Finally, he marched on the city of Lagash itself, the heart of the empire. And it's here that fiery vengeance in his heart burst out. The city didn't hold out for long. Lugal-Zaghazi burst over its walls, sacked the city, and burned it to the ground. Even by the standards of the time, this seems to have been a shocking act, as one piece of Sumerian poetry recalls with sorrow.
Because the man of Amma destroyed the bricks of Lagash, he committed a sin against the city's god. The god will cut off any hand raised against him. May Nadaba, the personal goddess of Lugal-Zaghazi, make him bear all these sins.
After sacking Lagash, Lugal-Zaghazi's momentum seems to have been unstoppable. He worked his way north, up the course of the two rivers, and soon he had conquered all the regions that Lagash had once claimed. One inscription written by him even claims to have conquered all the lands between what he calls the upper and the lower seas, meaning from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast.
Sorry, I forgot how to do the start. I gotta crank the stick.
The great god Enlil gave kingship of the land to him, the region from the lower sea through the Tigris and Euphrates to the upper
And I gotta
sea.
do wide. I might do
32
widescreen after.
kings gathered against
Okay, I can't really
He
jump between
defeated
those
them,
two sessions.
smote their cities, prostrated their lords, and destroyed the whole countryside as far as the silver mines.
Admittedly, this is probably something of an exaggeration. The Sumerians had never been able to maintain distant colonies or occupy far-off lands for very long. It's more likely that Lugal-Zaggisi
Oh yeah, and I need to go
pulled off
widescreen
something like
here
a
too.
successful raiding party on the coast, perhaps looting some towns and cities and bringing treasure back to Uruk. But this was the first time that a Sumerian prince had ever made this claim. For them, this upper sea was the western edge of their entire world,
We'll do some essay.
and the idea of a king who might conquer all the lands between the seas began to
Oh
possess
shit, what's
the
widescreen here?
imaginations of all the
This?
kings who came after. But King Lugal-Zaggisi, like the rulers of Lagash before him, had made the critical mistake of overstretching his resources. This empire was simply too big.
Wow, I'm so
Before long,
rusty.
civil
like it's
wars
insane.
and rebellions
I wasn't
broke out
cranking the
between
stick again.
various Sumerian cities. In this time of chaos, the other great people of Mesopotamia began to fancy their chances of ruling. These were the people who up until this moment had been something of a junior partner.
Oh
in
yeah, I
the
gotta go
civilization
around.
of
You gotta go
southern
the.
Iraq.
Alright, right.
These
It's
were the
fine.
people of Akkad. One man would soon lead them in an outright rebellion against the Sumerian Empire. He would go down in history with a name that in Akkadian means the one true king. That name was Sargon, and he ushered in the twilight of the Sumerian age.
I guess I should pause out if I don't pass away that
Like
guy,
many episodes in
keycard
Sumerian
guy, because I
history,
need that K-47.
the origin story of Sargon of Akkad is one you might find familiar if you were brought up on the stories of the Bible. He was born sometime in the middle of the 24th century BC, and legend has
But
it
the
that as a
cutscenes I can't
baby,
remember.
he was found in
I'm
a
gonna cut
reed
them.
basket on the banks of the Tigris.
I think he
He
cut
was
them right.
found by a gardener who worked in the palace in the city of Kish, and who brought him up as his son. But, like the biblical Moses, this foundling child had big
My PB is
ambitions.
26 in this level.
There seems to have been something special about him. Something about his charming manners meant that he was soon taken on as a cupbearer in the palace, bringing wine
Worth
to the
0
lords
points.
and royalty of the kingdom. This was a position of
Oh,
high
are we
honor
on?
and
I
a
do.
way for a young man to gain influence.
Oh,
at
maybe
court.
that's why. And auto aim off.
The
I
young
need.
Sargon must have proven himself in other ways too. That's because he was soon entrusted with a mission of the utmost secrecy and importance. At this time, Kish was still part of Lugal-Zaggisi's
Shit, what
Sumerian
did I turn
empire,
off?
stretching
Oh
over
my
all
god,
the
I need
lands
these fucking
between the two
English
seas.
settings. Fuck this
The
shit.
Sumerian king Lugal-Zaggisi was away on a distant campaign, possibly fighting in the lands of Syria or putting down a rebellion in a far-flung province. The young Sargon was given a small band of fighting men and told to travel to the city of Uruk, where Lugal-Zaggisi kept his royal court. Their plan was to strike the city.
Oh
in a
my god,
surprise
which one is
attack,
which? Jesus
to knock
fucking
out the
Christ, you're
capital
fucking
of this
serious
new
right now.
empire and free the city of Kish from imperial control. It was a daring plan. The tall city walls of Uruk,
Fuck is what?
immortalized
Oh,
in
this is
legend,
so
must have looked daunting to the young Sargon and his men as they readied for their attack. But Lugal-Zaggisi had taken much of his army with him on campaign and left few behind to defend his capital. The attack came as a complete surprise. Sargon's men overcame their defenses, poured over their walls,
So
and the
shit.
defenders fled. Sargon captured the city, and before reinforcements could arrive, he broke down several sections of those famous city walls. It was a deeply symbolic act, and a strike against the might of Lugal-Zaggisi's empire. King Lugal-Zaggisi must have been enraged. He swung around from his distant war-making and marched back home. gathering all his subject kings to him.
I'm gonna play more Japanese, but I'm just taking goddamn photos of the pause screens.
As many as
Jesus
50
Christ.
kings may have marched under his banner, and their task was easy enough: to crush the forces of one small city-state. But Sargon seems to have been one of those characters from history, one of those geniuses like Hannibal or Napoleon, who are able to turn battles in their favor no matter the odds. We don't know how he did it, but in a pitched battle with the whole amassed force of the empire, it was Sargon's army that emerged victorious. Lugal-Zagezi was captured, and Sargon marched him through the gates of the holy city of Nippur wearing a neckstock, a heavy piece of wood clapped around his neck and shoulders like an oxen. This would have been humiliating, of course, but here again is where Sargon sets himself apart from other rulers of the time. That's because he seems to have had something.
Oh, are you
of a
kidding me? I
merciful
don't even have the
streak.
fucking sheets in this card.
The
Like,
old king
Jesus fucking
Lugal-Zagezi
Christ,
wasn't
man.
killed. Incredibly, he was allowed to continue on as the governor of Uruk, so long as
Oh, I
he
just
swore an
hate it.
oath
I just
to
hate
the High
everyone.
King Sargon. Sargon founded a new city to act as his empire's capital, and he named it Akkad. From there, he would go on to conquer much of what the preceding empires had before, as one inscription beneath a statue in the city of Nippur claims.
Sargon, the king of Kish, triumphed in 34 battles over the cities, up to the edge of the sea, and destroyed their walls. He bowed down to the gods, and the gods gave him the upper land, up to the cedar forest, and up to the silver mountain.
And Sargon didn't make the mistakes of his predecessors. At each city he conquered, he made a point of destroying the city's walls, reducing its ability to defend itself, and therefore reducing the likelihood of it rebelling against his rule. He conducted a ceremony to symbolize his mastery over the whole land. He washed his weapons in the waters of both the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. But once the dust of war had settled, his achievements went on. He made efforts to centralize the empire's administration and even reformed the dating system. His reforms strengthened the central state and increased the stability of the empire. In many ways, he was something of a progressive and enlightened ruler. But Sargon was also Akkadian, and he was what we today might call a nationalist. Until now, Sumerian had been the official language of royal inscriptions on palaces and temples. But during Sargon's reign, Akkadian began to be used in official inscriptions for the first time. The cuneiform alphabet was now re-engineered to write Akkadian, and Sargon also gave himself the new title, King of Akkad. He appointed only his fellow Akkadians to key positions in the government, and garrisoned Sumerian cities with Akkadian troops to ensure their loyalty. The two people of Mesopotamia, who had lived and grown together for millennia, were now beginning to drift apart. Resentment in the southern Sumerian-speaking cities began to reach a boiling point. Sargon ruled
I'll be right back. Be back in a
55
second.
years, and towards the end of his reign, this resentment bubbled over, as one later Babylonian text recalls.
In his old age, all the lands revolted against him, and they besieged him in Akkad the city. But he went forth to battle and defeated them. He knocked them over and destroyed their vast army.
For the meantime, it's clear that Sargon's flair for battle kept his empire together. But as the old king weakened, virtually all the southern cities burst out in open rebellion. When Sargon of Akkad died around the year 2284, his two sons had to take over and try to fix the mess he had left behind. The first of these sons was called Rimush. He ruled for 9 years, and spent most of them in bitter battles to reconquer the rebellious Sumerian cities of the south. He crushed rebellions in Ur, Umma, Lagash, and Adab, and one of the years in which he ruled is even known as the year that Adab was destroyed. When Rimush died, Sargon's other son, Manishtushu, took over. He seems to have resorted to the kinds of terror tactics that had once made the kings of Lagash so hated. It was Sargon's grandson, a man named Naram Sin, who would return the empire to its former greatness. He managed to quell the Sumerian rebellion in its southern heartlands and returned the empire of Akkad to stability. And Naram Sin didn't rule only by force. It seems he made some effort to reconcile the two intertwined peoples of Mesopotamia, breaking from his grandfather's title, King of Akkad, and ruling under the more diplomatic title, King of Sumer and Akkad. But this didn't entirely heal the rift that was even now continuing to grow between these two peoples. Part of the problem was that the Sumerian people were no longer the primary cultural force in the region. For centuries, Akkadian had been gradually replacing Sumerian as a spoken language. Some of this may have been down to the official policies of the Akkadian Empire, discouraging the use of Sumerian in official documents. But it was also affected by the increasingly cosmopolitan makeup of the empire. Sumerian, as we've seen, was a language isolate, with a different structure and sound to all the languages around it. But the people who lived in all the surrounding lands spoke languages that were linguistic cousins of Akkadian, all in the Semitic family of languages. They had the same grammar and even shared sounds and words with Akkadian. Learning Akkadian for them would have been like an English speaker learning French or Spanish, while Sumerian would have been like learning Korean. Akkadian was just easier to learn for these people, and so it would naturally become the language of trade and commerce. The people of Mesopotamia had been largely bilingual for centuries, but gradually all Sumerians would have learned to speak Akkadian, and fewer Akkadians would have needed to learn Sumerian. Slowly, the Sumerian language began to fade. But the days of the Akkadian Empire were also numbered, and the Sumerians would get one more chance to leave their mark on the world's history. When the great Akkadian king Naram Sin died, his son Shah Kali-Shari took over. He was Sargon of Akkad's great-grandson, and 4 years into his reign, a great celestial sign would have appeared in the skies overhead. Far out in the depths of space, nearly 200 million kilometers away from Earth, a giant ball of ice and dust, 40 kilometers across, flew past, sometime around the year 2213 BC. This was the comet Hale-Bopp. It would spend the next 4 millennia or so flying through our solar system on a deep elliptical orbit, until it flew past the Earth again as a blazing streak of light in the year 1997. It was the brightest comet with the longest tail that has ever been observed in our night skies. It remained visible with the naked eye for 18 months. In 1997, the sight of the comet in San Diego, California, caused 39 members of an apocalyptic cult called Heaven's Gate to commit suicide by drinking a lethal mixture of vodka and phenobarbital. They believed that their souls would be carried away on a spaceship that was hidden behind the iridescent tail of the comet. And we can only imagine what effect the sight of this comet may have had on ancient people. Some may have looked up and seen the blessings of the gods, smiling on the lands of Sumer and Akkad. Others may have stared up at that lonely cosmic traveler and seen a sign of doom. Ultimately, it was these latter who would prove correct.
Oh my gosh.
During the reign of King Shah Kalishari, the world's climate underwent a mysterious and sudden shift. This change is known only by the cryptic name, the 4.2 kilo-year event. It has been tentatively linked to changes that took place in the sea ice of the North Atlantic, causing ripples throughout the world's delicate and intimately interlinked climate systems. But whatever the causes, its effects were dramatic. In various places around the world, it coincided with periods of reduced rainfall. Studies of dust layers in Iraq and the Middle East have shown that around this time annual rainfall dropped dramatically, and the climate became much more arid. The annual floods of the rivers, on which so much of the agriculture of the region depended, would now routinely fail, and famine would set in. And this dry period wasn't brief. In fact, it would last for well over a century, and some think it may have even lasted for the next 300 years. This period of drought and the famines it caused were mentioned in Egyptian texts of the time too, and it affected cultures all around the globe. It's been linked to civilizational collapses in Egypt's Old Kingdom, the Indus Valley civilization in India, and the Langzhou culture in China. In Mesopotamia around this time, still ruled by the Akkadian Empire, it's clear that resources became suddenly scarce. The days of a booming surplus of food were over, and it's around this time that the first towns and cities began to be abandoned in the drier zones of the north. After the death of King Shah Kalishari around the year 2193 BC, a period of chaos and bitter civil war descended on the empire of Akkad. The Sumerian king list records this period with an almost sarcastic tone.
Then who was king? Who was not the king? 4 of them ruled in only 3 years.
All this chaos did not go unnoticed. In the mountains overlooking the plains of Mesopotamia, a nomadic tribal people known as the Guti were watching. Who the Guti were, what language they spoke, and which gods they worshipped, we don't know. They seem to have been an unsophisticated nomadic people, and the ancient Sumerian texts reserve particular contempt for them.
The Guti were unhappy people, unaware of how to revere the gods, and ignorant of the right religious practices.
The Guti had raided and plundered along the borders of the Akkadian Empire for years, burning villages and stealing cattle. One remarkable letter, dating from the reign of King Shah Kalishari, was written by an Akkadian lord who owned land on the borders of the Guti territory. He tells his workers to ignore the Guti attacks and keep working, although it's clear he does this while keeping himself at a safe distance.
Cultivate the field and watch over the cattle. Do not tell me the Guti enemies are around. I could not cultivate the field. Post sentries at 1 mile intervals, and if the Guti try to attack you, take all the cattle into the village. Now I swear on the life of King Shah Kalishari that if the Guti men drive off the cattle and you cannot pay for them yourself, I won't pay you any silver when I come to town.
For years now, these hill people had watched as drought ravaged the settled societies of the river valley. They watched as the city dwellers fought over the increasingly scarce farmland. And it's in this moment of weakness that they chose to strike.
Thank you so much, Anonymous.
The Guti gathered their forces and marched down from the hills into the lands of Sumer. This time,
Thank you,
not to
Anonymous.
raid, but to invade and take these lands for themselves. One remarkable literary text relates the tragic events of those days. It was written a few centuries
Really, thank
later.
you so much for that sub.
It is
Thank you
called
so much. You
The
fucking are the
Curse
best.
of Akkad. In this version of the story, the great god
my
Enlil
gosh.
is angry at the king of Akkad for disrespecting the gods, and he summons the Guti as a punishment. The hill people are imagined as monstrous creatures, half animal, with a language that sounded to the Sumerians like the barking of dogs.
Enlil, what destruction he wrought. He raised his eyes to the mountain and mustered the whole mountain as one. The rebellious people, the land whose people is without number, Gutium, that land that brooks no control, whose understanding is human, but whose appearance and stuttering words are that of a dog. Enlil brought them down from the mountain. In vast numbers, like locusts, they covered the earth. Nothing escaped their arm. No one escaped their arm. All the lands raised a bitter cry on their city walls.
It's not clear how many men were in the Guti army, but they were enough to quickly overwhelm the weakened forces of Akkad. It seems the Guti practiced hit-and-run tactics, raiding supply lines and leaving
Why?
scorched earth behind them. Their attacks devastated the economy of Akkad, and the already drought-ridden and war-torn society began to fall apart.
For the first time since cities were built and founded, the great agricultural tracts produced no grain. The inundated tracts produced no fish. The irrigated orchards produced neither syrup nor wine. The gathered clouds did not rain. The plants did not grow. He who slept on the roof died on the roof. He who slept in the house had no burial. People were flailing at themselves from hunger.
The weakened Akkadian society folded completely beneath the pressure of the Guti attacks. The demoralized Akkadian army went out to meet this fearsome enemy in battle and was defeated. Soon after, the Guti swept down
Why?
on the city of Akkad and burned it to the ground. They destroyed Sargon city so utterly that its ruins have never been found. The Guti attempted to set up their own dynasty and rule over the lands of Sumer. But for a number of reasons, they were not successful.
Why?
After all, as empires in our own day have found out, it's much easier to conquer a country than it is to rule it. Cuneiform sources suggest that the Guti administration showed little concern for maintaining agriculture, written records, or public safety. The Guti were not literate and would have struggled to administrate an empire that for over a millennium had relied on the power of the written word. For reasons known only to them, and perhaps relating to their nomadic lifestyle, they didn't believe in keeping animals in pens. They released all of the land's livestock to roam about the countryside freely. Their policies soon brought even further famine and caused a massive increase in the price of grain. Under neglect and lack of investment, the land's infrastructure began to crumble. The poetry of the Curse of Akkad shows how the roads of the kingdom began to fall apart and become overgrown with weeds, while long grass grew on the tow paths where oxen used to pull barges.
The grass grows long on your canal bank towpaths. The grass of mourning grows on your highways laid for wagons. Wild rams and snakes of the mountains allow no one to pass on your towpaths, built up with canal sediment.
The destruction of the central authority of the Akkadian Empire meant that during this time a number of Sumerian city-states reasserted their independence. And it seems the Guti, weakened by their failing attempt to hold an empire together, don't seem to have been able to do much to stop them. The Guti occupied
I might get a
southern
weightlifting
Iraq
stream
for
in
more than
actually done
150
right now,
years.
honestly, instead of this.
And this period was by all
I
accounts
don't know. I mean,
a time
I'm
of
not.
suffering.
I appreciate the anonymous
It
gift
was
sub.
a
I
miniature
really do.
dark
I'm going out
where written
to
records are unsophisticated as well as few and far between.
going out to
But as
drive in the
resentment to their
park
rule
today.
grew,
It's gonna be nice.
rebellions rose around the country, and one Sumerian man would see the opportunity this period of crisis
With my
provided.
girlfriend, it would be nice.
He was filled with a desire
Going into the
to return the lands of
Gatno
Sumer
Park.
to the rule of a Sumerian king, and his name was Utu Hengal. Little is known about the life of Utu Hengal.
What?
He was a Sumerian and may have been the governor of Uruk during the final years of the Gutian period.
So
He
today's
must
not
have
going to be an
watched as the
insane all
ongoing
day
famine ravaged his people,
GoldenEye grind.
and the arrogant Guti kings refused to do anything about it, violently punishing any resistance to them.
I might do that.
At this time, a new Guti king had just ascended to the throne of Sumer and Akkad. His name was
Actually, no.
Tiridates.
I'm gonna do that after. I'm
He
gonna do that
seems to
maybe
have been
tomorrow or
typical
something.
of the Guti
I was gonna do it
rulers.
last night. I was
He
just so
cared
tired
little
last
for
night.
maintaining the land's infrastructure,
After all
and
that
even
GoldenEye.
destroyed elements of it to punish populations who rebelled against him, as recalled in the Sumerian king list.
Tirigan's troops established themselves everywhere. Nobody would leave their cities to face him. In the south, in Sumer, he blocked the water from the fields. In the uplands, he closed off the roads. Because of him, the grass grew high on the highways of the land.
Tirigan had been on the throne for only 40 days, and he was still in the middle of consolidating his rule. It's clear that Utu Hengal, the governor of Uruk, thought that this was the time to make his move. His plan may have been in place for years. Perhaps he sent out secret envoys to the other Sumerian cities of the south, telling them to prepare for war the moment a new king ascended to the throne. And then, when everything was in place and his moment came, he struck. When Tirigan heard of this rebellion, he must have been enraged. But he doesn't seem to have been the bravest of kings. He sent two of his generals, men named Unenazu and Nabi Enlil, to lead his armies in his place, while he stayed back home in the palace. Meanwhile, the rebel leader Utu Hengal massed his forces and marched to meet the two Guti generals on the field. On his way to the decisive battle, he stopped at the temple of Ishkur, the Sumerian god of storms, and made an offering. He may have sacrificed a lamb or goat and sang an ancient prayer in the Sumerian tongue before the altar of the god. Then he marched out to meet Tirigan's armies.
After departing from the temple of Ishkur, on the fourth day he set up camp in Nagsu on the Surangal Canal. He captured the generals of Tirigan, sent as envoys to Sumer, and put chains on their hands.
Utu Hengal was victorious. And here again, we see that the Guti king Tirigan wasn't a courageous sort. After getting the news that his generals had been defeated, he fled north to a city called Dabrun. The Sumerian king list records what happened next.
Then Tirigan, the king of the Guti, ran away alone on foot. He thought himself safe in Dabrun, where he fled to save his life. But since the people of Dabrun knew that Utu Hengal was a king endowed with power by Enlil, they did not let Tirigan go, and an envoy of Utu Hengal arrested Tirigan together with his wife and children in Dabrun. He put handcuffs and a blindfold on him.
After centuries, the Sumerians finally rejected both Guti and Akkadian rule. For the first time since the reign of Sargon, a Sumerian king would once again rule over the lands of Sumer.
Utu-Hengal made the Guti,
Why?
the fanged snakes of the mountains, go back to drink again from the rocky crevices. He brought back the kingship of Sumer.
Oh my gosh.
Utu-Hengal's successful rebellion ushered in an era known today as the Third Dynasty of Ur, and sometimes called the Neo-Sumerian Empire. Others have even called this the Sumerian Renaissance. It was the final flourishing of Sumerian culture, but it was a flourishing that would leave an indelible
Yo,
mark
daughter, what's up,
on
man?
human
Saying gifts
history.
and thanks you, yeah. I know, insane anonymous. Yo, thanks, man. Appreciate that, dude.
Despite bringing the kingship
Big time.
back to Sumer, the rebel king
Thanks,
Utu-Hengal
man.
didn't rule for long. He died in unusual circumstances after only 7
Nice,
years.
dude. Thanks, man. Yeah,
Apparently
insane
killed
anonymous.
when a river dam that he was inspecting burst, sweeping him away in a flood.
Just so blessed.
If you think
so
this
blessed and
sounds
lucky.
suspicious, it's because it probably is.
Thanks, man.
One of Utu-Hengal's more ambitious
I don't
governors,
know.
a man named Ur-Nammu, came to the throne soon after. And some historians have certainly raised questions about whether he had a hand in that dam bursting. If
I might
indeed
try different
any
levels,
dam
just mixing it
burst
up
at all.
at random times.
Regardless of the way he rose to power, Ur-Nammu proved to be an effective ruler and an
I
outstanding
think I'm gonna set up
administrator.
my English cart for
He
Bunker 1
standardized
SA.
bronze weights that merchants used in the market
Widescreen
and created
and
a standardized weight that would lay
all
down
the way
the
off and
foundations for
everything.
the first currencies. He divided silver into a unit known as the mina, which was made up of 60 shekels.
I guess I can have a different file too.
Ur-Nammu also wrote down
The
a
file
code of
has that
laws
memory.
that today is the
guess
earliest
I could do
surviving
that.
example of a legal code, 3 centuries older than the more famous Code of Hammurabi. Here are a few examples of the laws contained within.
Number 17. If a slave escapes from the city limits and someone returns him, the owner shall pay 2 shekels to the one who returned him. Number 18. If a man knocks out the eye of another man, he shall weigh out half a mina of
This is
silver.
this file, right?
Number 19. If a man has cut off another man's foot, he is to pay 10 shekels.
Oh no, what? I didn't remember it? Why? Was it the wrong file? What?
Among all his other achievements, Ur-Nammu was also a prodigious builder. He constructed buildings
Insane.
at the cities of Nippur, Larsa, Kish, Adab, and Umma.
Whatever.
He rebuilt the kingdom's roads and
Thanks, man.
irrigation ditches after the long decades of neglect under the Guti rule. But more than anything, Ur-Nammu loved to build ziggurats. These are the distinctive stepped towers
Terrible.
that were the hallmarks and pinnacle of Sumerian architecture. Each one rose in 3 layers like a wedding cake, with steps leading up to the top. They would have been painted with white gypsum paint. The priests who kept them may have grown plants and trees on the terraces that lined them, and birds would have roosted high up in these tall towers. Under Ur-Nammu, soon every Sumerian city would have a ziggurat, and they formed the focal point of the cities. The greatest of these was the ziggurat that Ur-Nammu built in his home city of Ur. The ziggurat of Ur is enormous. In its day, it would have soared up to a height of 30 meters, or nearly 10 stories, towering over all the other low-lying buildings in the city. It was built purely from baked clay bricks and held together with the tarry substance bitumen. It's thought that it would have taken at least 1,500 workers more than 5 years just to build its
Why?
base. Farmers up to 20 kilometers away would have been able to see this enormous shape rising on the horizon. To them, it would have testified to
I
the
forgot I
power
had
of
the
the
KF7.
city of Ur and the god who lived there. But despite this late flourishing, the age of the Sumerians was passing. And part of the reason for this lay in the soil beneath their feet.
Man.
All river water contains small amounts of salts and other minerals.
Oh, I can't
The
really hit
Tigris
it.
and Euphrates rivers, flowing over the limestone rocks of the Taurus Mountains, contain more than most. When ancient farmers diverted this water into their fields to feed their crops, the hot sun would evaporate this water,
What?
and traces of salt would be left behind. In places with a reasonable amount of rainfall, the rain would wash this salt away. But in the arid conditions of Iraq, the salt stays right where it is. Over time, this small amount builds up on the surface of the soil, and eventually plants find it difficult to grow. The records of the Sumerian scribes paint a bleak picture. They kept meticulous notes of crop yields year on year, and from around 2350 BC,
That would be
their
tragic.
texts show the
It's
gradual
weird to do that
reduction
left strafe. It's weird to do
crops
that
across the region.
beginning and bunker one and left.
One telltale detail
Just weird.
shows us that the salt content of the soil might have been to blame. While their main crop of wheat gradually reduced over the centuries, the rates of barley production remained constant. Barley, as we know today, is particularly resistant to salt-rich soil. Texts uncovered from the city of Girsu show that around the year 3550 BC, wheat and barley were being produced in equal amounts. But after 1,000 years of irrigation, wheat accounted for only 1/6 of the crop. And only a few centuries later, in the 21st century BC, wheat was less than 2% of the annual harvest. This all points to a sharp increase in the salt content of the soil. You can sometimes hear very simplistic narratives surrounding soil salination in the south of Iraq. The Sumerians are sometimes portrayed as stupid or greedy, damaging the land in their ignorance. But that's not entirely fair. Although they didn't have our modern understanding, they did know that soil needed to be rested for several seasons if it was to remain fertile. And they did take steps to adapt to the changing condition of the soil, switching almost exclusively to barley and replacing the role of wheat in their diet. They also developed methods for draining the soil and reducing the rate of salination. But soil salinity is a challenge that still causes problems for farmers in Iraq today, despite all our technology and scientific knowledge. While the ancient people worked hard to mitigate the decline, the overall trend as the centuries wore on was slow but unstoppable. The soil was gradually failing.
Wow, so bad.
And with the population of Sumerian
Such a bad
cities
Goldeneye
growing
player at this
and the
level,
long
holy
drought
jeez.
dragging on, the demands on this farm
Oh my gosh.
were only increasing. Eventually, a thick layer of salt would encrust the topsoil, and little would grow at all. Today, when you walk around the deserts of Iraq, the soil in some areas has a crumbly crust that cracks underfoot, peeling like old varnish. This is the salt that slowly began to choke the life from the earth, and in turn choke the life from the civilization of Sumer. But the end of Sumerian culture would come not from the soil, but at the tip of a spear.
Why?
As the Sumerians struggled to eke ever-decreasing barley crops from the salty soil, it seems that once again, hostile outside forces began to sense weakness in this once great empire. After their failed attempt at empire building, the nomadic Guti had retreated to their mountains and returned to their nomadic ways. But they still posed a threat to Sumerian lands. just as they always had,
Fucking hell,
raiding
man.
towns and making away with cattle.
This level
Putting a
is
stop
just
to
so
these
impossible.
raids was the
It's
focus
too
of
impossible,
much of
man.
the King Ur-Nammu's reign.
It's too much.
He raised an army and marched into the Guti lands with the aim of putting a stop to the threat forever. It's unclear whether he actually met them in battle or whether he was struck by one of their characteristic ambushes. Either way, Ur-Nammu was killed in the mountains, far from home. The death
Oh,
of this
like,
king,
there's no way.
which would
There's
begin
no way.
the final death spiral of Sumerian culture, was commemorated
Like, I'm not even
in a
close.
lengthy epic poem known as the Death of Ur-Nammu.
He who was beloved by the troops could not raise his neck anymore. The wise one lay down. Silence descended. As he who was the vigor of the land had fallen, the land became demolished like a mountain. Like a cypress forest, it was stripped. Its appearance changed.
The poem tells the story of Ur-Nammu descending into the underworld and giving his offerings to the gods who lived there. And
What
in the
is this?
afterlife,
Why?
the poem gives Ur-Nammu himself this final lament.
Now, just as the rain pouring down from heaven cannot turn back, I can never return to see the beautiful bricks of Ur.
4 Sumerian kings would follow Ur-Nammu. Some, like the king Shulgi, enjoyed successes on the battlefield and developed and reformed the economy as much as they could. But their reigns were characterized by ongoing threats from the wild mountain regions. The drought was still biting. The soil was becoming increasingly choked by salt. And as food got scarce, more and more nomadic people were driven to raiding and plundering to feed themselves. By now, the Guti were far from the only people who threatened the border of Sumer and Akkad. One tribe in particular, known as the Martu, posed a particular threat. The Martu were a Semitic sheep-herding people from the mountains of Syria and Lebanon. Like the Guti, the Sumerians considered them to be wild and barbarous, and tended to describe them in contemptuous but also fearful terms.
The Martu, the powerful south wind, who from the remote past have not known cities. The Martu who know no grain. The Martu who know no house or town. The savages of the mountains. The Martu who eat raw meat, who are not buried after their death.
Another text describes them in similar animalistic terms as the Guti.
The hostile Martu have entered the plains. The Martu, a ravaging
I'll look
people
up
with
sooner there.
canine instincts like wolves.
And it's clear that around this time of drought and famine, the Martu were finding their way of life in Syria increasingly impossible.
What? Why?
Environmental pressures were pushing them further south into the rich farmland of the river valley, into the lands of the Sumerians.
What is this? Why?
Despite the weakened power of the Sumerian state, the later kings of Sumer were determined to stop the Martu incursions. One king, named Shu-Sin, even ordered the construction of a wall that stretched almost 300 kilometers between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It would be called the Martu Wall, and sometimes the wall facing the high lands. What form exactly this wall took is unknown, since its remains have never been found. But it was likely an earthwork rampart, dotted with forts, and perhaps fronted with a moat fed by canals. It was more than twice the length of Hadrian's Wall,
I can't
and
believe I missed
essentially
that
turned
fucking
the
guard,
rich farmland
man.
between the Tigris and Euphrates into an island fortress, with the rivers on either side, the sea to the south, and the wall to the north. It would have been an enormous engineering work, and shows that even in its final years, the Sumerian state still commanded considerable manpower and energy. But ultimately, the wall would prove useless. Like all walls, it was only effective with a constant garrison manning it. Soon it would become clear that the building of this wall was not an act of strength, but the last resort of an empire falling in on itself. The last Sumerian king was a man named Ibbi-Sin, who took the throne in the year 2028.
It's not an easy strat. Just getting that camera,
Virtually
it's
as
not.
soon as he was crowned,
That
the
photo.
empire began to fall apart. In his first year of ruling, the eastern city of Ashuna broke free from the empire, and Susa, a city in the region of Elam in the Iranian lowlands, successfully rebelled in the third year. These Elamites were an ambitious people. They were rivals for the later Assyrian and Babylonian empires, but at this stage were only just beginning to flex their muscles. Their rise would spell the end of the Sumerian age. The fracturing Sumerian Empire could no longer maintain its defenses along the 300 kilometers of the Great Martu Wall. And so, in the 5th year of his reign, the wall that Ibbi-Sin's father had built failed. The Martu poured over the defenses and overran the rich farmlands that lay behind. The effects of this loss were immediate and devastating.
Oh yeah, I don't know what I'm doing here with the
Food shortages ran
cutscenes.
rampant. In years 7 and 8 of Ibbi-Sin's kingship, the price of grain increased to 60 times the usual cost. People would have starved in the streets. The famine was hitting the capital city of Ur especially hard. And it's clear that at this point, the king Ibbi-Sin really began to panic. Desperate to feed his people, King Ibbi-Sin summoned one of his generals and told him to travel north to the city of Isin to buy grain and pay many times its usual cost. This general was a man called Ishbi-Era, and it's clear that he wasn't the most trusted of the king's generals. In another letter, the king had even complained that Ishbi-Era was Akkadian, not Sumerian, inferring that his loyalty may have been in question. But at this point, it's clear the king didn't have much choice. One remarkable letter from this moment has survived.
Why? Why? Like, check
It was
this out.
sent to the king Ibbi-Sin
What?
by this general, Ishbi-Era, once he reached
Oh
the city of
man, that
Isin.
wasn't that good actually.
It paints a vivid picture of Sumerian society's collapse.
You ordered me to travel to Isin and Kazalu to purchase grain? With grain reaching the exchange rate of 1 shekel of silver per gur, 20 talents of silver have been invested in the purchase. But I heard news that the hostile Martu have entered inside your territories. I entered with the entire amount of grain. Now, I have let the Martu, all of them, penetrate inside the land. Because of the Martu, I am unable to hand over this grain for threshing. They are stronger than me, while I am condemned to sitting around.
This letter shows that the twin pressures of the Martu invasions, coupled with the famine at home, were beginning to tear the very fabric of the kingdom apart. The Akkadian general Ishbi-Era urges the king to send a fleet of 600 boats up the river to transport the grain. He also kindly offers to stay behind in Isin and help to defend it against the invasion.
That I should guard for you the cities of Isin and Nibru, let it be my responsibility. My lord should know this.
It's possible that Ishbi-Era knew that the request for 600 boats was impossible. In fact, he had no intention of ever heading back to the starving city of Ur. He stayed in Isin with all the grain, and soon declared himself its king. This is just one story out of many that shows the Sumerian state truly beginning to come apart. Facing threats on multiple sides, the king Ibbi-Sin entered into a frantic series of last-ditch measures. He ordered fortifications built at the important cities of Ur and Nippur, but these efforts were in vain. Ultimately, the Sumerian Empire fell apart, one city at a time, until
I'm gonna take a break and then I'm probably gonna play more Aztec Double O for a little bit.
By hostile forces. Soon, the Elamite people, those former subjects of the Sumerians in the foothills of Iran, marched down
Just get my
along the
muscle
hill
memory
paths,
back.
gathering with them an army of tribesmen, and laid siege to the great city of Ur. King Ibbi-Sin tried one last
so
attempt
dumb.
to beat them back.
You have some issue? Oh,
But
thanks,
it's clear
man. I
at this
mean,
point
yeah,
how
thanks, dude.
desperate he was.
It's good if we
He
get
tried to enlist the help
progress.
of his great enemy, the wild Martu, who had poured over his father's wall. He offered to pay them in exchange for their help.
Thanks, man.
He even swallowed his pride.
I mean, it's only
and begged for
good
the
if
help
it's, we
of
get
Ishbi-Erra, the general
our
who
times.
had stabbed him in the back on that journey for grain, and was now ruling as the king of Isin. But it was all useless. The Elamites broke through the walls of Ur and set the city
Why
on
come?
fire.
Like, it's just so dumb, man.
They poured into its sacred
Guess his mood, he would have been too
and
slow
looted it
anyways.
of all its valuables. We can imagine them storming up the steps of Ur's great ziggurat, killing priests and plundering its treasures as they went. The surrounding fields were burned, and the waterways
So fast that pause
became
was, is insane.
contaminated with disease. The armies of Elam stormed the royal palace and captured the king Ibbi-Sin. They took him away in chains, marched him back to their homeland and imprisoned him there. This was the last king of Sumer, a civilization that had endured for millennia, and he would die in chains, imprisoned by his enemies in a foreign land.
Like, why?
The ancient Sumerians, who saw the destruction of their cities, reacted to their sorrow in the same way that humans always have. They wrote poetry. In fact, for each of their great ruined cities, they wrote a lament. One of these poems, called The Lament for Ur, relates with tangible anguish the horror of that time.
The gods have abandoned us. Like migrating birds, they have gone. Ur is destroyed. Bitter is its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like hot
Oh,
bronze
why?
in a
Like,
mold.
why?
Bodies dissolve like fat
Why,
in the sun.
man?
Our temple is destroyed. Smoke lies on our city
That
like
first
a shroud.
bullet.
Blood flows as the river does, the lamenting of men and women. Sadness abounds. Ur is no more.
The fall of Ur was one of the great turning points in ancient history. It marked the end of the unified Sumerian state, and the region entered a small dark age, in which individual city-states once again vied for control over the ruins of the former empire. The wars of this period turned
blow
Sumerian
up?
cities to blackened
Man,
heaps
that
of
was like,
burnt
I
brick.
got boosted. I was perfectly lined
The
up,
people
whatever.
mourn.
I'm not gonna
Its
get the
people
photo
like broken
anyways, I know I
potsherds
am not.
littering the approaches. The walls were gaping, the high gates, the
See?
roads were piled with
I
dead.
haven't gotten the
In
photo
all
like, yet,
streets
and I haven't even
roadways,
gotten the
bodies
door.
lay.
This level sucks.
In open fields that used to fill the
What's the
dances,
speed?
the people lay in heaps.
It was just so bad, man.
And meanwhile, the drought dragged
Maybe
on,
I just suck.
and the salt-ridden fields were no longer producing enough barley. Faced with these problems, the Sumerian people began to flock out of the region in huge numbers, refugees carrying with them their meager belongings and weeping for the home they had left behind.
Oh, the boosts, man.
Over the next centuries, a vast population movement took place, from the south of Mesopotamia to the north. Some of these Sumerian speakers would settle in the Akkadian lands. But with their connection to their homeland severed, their cultural identity went with it. They learned the Akkadian language of the northerners and left theirs behind in the smoking ruins of their cities. The Martu, those wild hill people so detested by the Sumerians, would themselves settle down in the cities they conquered along the river valley. The migrating Martu, the fleeing Sumerians, and the native Akkadians would mix together. They would blend their cultures as the people of this region always had. The foundations they laid would give rise to the next chapter of Mesopotamian and human history, and forge the region's next superpowers. These would rise as the legendary empires of Babylon and Assyria. But those are stories that I will save for another time. Sumerian was now a dead language. It would never again be heard spoken in the streets and the markets.
Aww.
But it did remain in use for at least another 2,000 years, preserved in the temples and scriptures of later empires. Just as Latin once survived in the churches of medieval Europe after the fall of Rome.
That back boost is just so dumb.
For these
man.
later people, Sumerian became the language of the gods, the language of myth and magic. The kings of Ur, those great Sumerian rulers, themselves passed into legend, and some of them would later be revered as gods themselves. And all the kings of Mesopotamia, in Babylon and Assyria for the next 2,000 years, would rule under a title that gave them a kind of ancient legitimacy, reaching right back to the First Age, to the dawn of mankind's journey into civilization. King of Ur, King of Sumer and Akkad. Even after the fall of the Sumerian Empire, many of its great cities would continue as population centers into the post-Sumerian era. Among these was the great coastal city of Ur, situated at the mouth of the Euphrates, which would rise and fall a number of times over its history. But ultimately, it was the landscape that had given birth to Ur, and it was the landscape that would bring about its demise. Today, if you stand in the ruins of Ur, the sea that once lapped its shores is nowhere to be seen. In fact, early archaeologists were astonished to see the remains of millions of seashells scattered in the sand here on this lonely stretch of desert. As the millennia passed, the continued depositing of silt, along with changes in global sea levels, have combined to push Iraq's Gulf Coast back to its present position, about 150 kilometers to the south. The Euphrates River, that once brought the rich bounties of trade down from the north, has also disappeared, its course having changed over the centuries. In fact, around the barren mounds of earth where the city of Ur once stood, there's nothing at all but the lone and level sands of the Iraqi desert, boundless and bare for miles around. Water had always been this city's lifeblood, and the loss of the river and the sea meant the slow death of Ur. People soon left its houses and its streets. They stopped working its fields and maintaining its irrigation canals, and soon the land dried up and the topsoil blew away in the wind. The priests extinguished the fires that burned in the top chamber of Ur's great ziggurat, and stopped leaving their offerings.
Man, my fourth camera's
there
just
to
so
the moon
bad.
god's
I have a
sin.
terrible fourth camera.
The markets closed, and the mud brick
Or third
buildings
camera,
of the
rather.
city began to crumble. The wooden beams of the roofs rotted and fell in. The sands and desert winds rolled through its streets, and the dunes buried its fallen walls. Before long, the greatest city the world had ever known was just a mound of ruins, where the occasional desert traveler would pass by, and where the Italian traveler Pietro della Valle would one day shelter with his wife from a threatening group of bandits, and discover the scattered fragments of writing that the Sumerians had left behind in their forgotten language. Somewhere buried in the ruins lay the clay tablets on which the lament for the city's destruction.
Alright, I'm gonna use the washroom, take a break.
May
Try one
their
more time on
storms
this level,
swoop
and then I'm
down
gonna
no
take
more
my
on your
break
city.
and maybe reload the
May
vape.
the door
Oh
be closed
yeah.
on it, like the great city gate at night time.
Do more
Until
Aztec.
distant days, other days,
I miss the Aztec
future
now.
days.
See?
In your city,
When you do another
reduced to
level, you
ruined
start
mounds,
missing
may a lament be made to you. O
your
Nana,
home.
may your restored city be resplendent before you.
Start missing it. Everything you hated about it,
Following the sacking
it just
of Ur around
dissolves,
the year
and then you miss it.
2000 BC, the city of Uruk went into a steep decline, and much of its population
It's a
fled.
fun level too. My fourth camera is just so
Uruk did
terrible.
have another period of flourishing
My third
when
camera.
the
I mean.
later Assyrian
Get fresh and
Empire
on me, thanks,
rebuilt
homie.
it as a regional capital. But as the Euphrates
Thanks,
River
man.
changed
Exactly.
its course, Uruk
Yeah.
too would be completely abandoned. Today, the walls of Uruk, the same walls that are boasted about in the Epic of Gilgamesh, are still visible. Heaps of ancient brickwork lining the flat lunar landscape of the desert. But they are still 15 meters tall, encircling the whole city, now washed by a tide of broken pottery and bones. The English archaeologist William Loftus was the first European to rediscover the ruins of Uruk. He was impressed with the haunting sight of the vast mounds rising out of the desert, and he later wrote about how the site affected him.
Of all the desolate sights I ever beheld, that of Uruk incomparably surpasses all.
The process of decay in all the cities of ancient Sumer, in Nippur, Eridu, Lagash, Ur, and Uruk, would have been gradual but unstoppable.
Oh my god, my third camera.
Wind-borne sand and earth would pile up against the walls that still stood and filled in the streets. Meanwhile, rainwater and wind wore down any remaining structures. The sight of these ruins amazed travelers who, like the Italian della Valle, passed by them and saw their lonely shapes on the horizon. People told stories about what must have happened to those people who built such enormous constructions and then disappeared forever. Echoes of these stories still survive in tales like the Tower of Babel, about a people who built a tower that would reach to the heavens and who were struck down by God on account of their pride. With their cities lost, the Sumerian people passed out of history.
Okay.
The civilizations who replaced them, who kept their language alive in their temples and still told stories of their
Yeah,
kings,
and I'll play
would
some more Aztec after,
themselves
thanks.
pass into ruin. The knowledge of how to read Sumerian was forgotten entirely, and its history turned to dust. Only their clay tablets remained, buried in the sands of Iraq, fragments containing the voices of a whole people, waiting for archaeologists to discover them, and, through arduous and painstaking work, to find out how to read them. These fragments give us little bursts of light, illuminating the dark ocean floor of this most distant past, giving us the records and recipes of the Sumerian people, their music and their prayers, their loves and grief, their triumphs, and their beautiful, sorrowful lamentations for the loss of the world's first cities. And it gives us, too, the wistful philosophies of these ancient people, as these lines from the Epic of Gilgamesh show.
Nobody sees death. Nobody sees the face of death. Nobody hears the voice of death. Savage death just cuts mankind down. Sometimes we build a house, sometimes we make a nest, but then brothers divide it upon inheritance. Sometimes there is hostility in the land, but then the river rises and brings floodwater. Dragonflies drift on the river. Their faces look upon the face of the sun, but then suddenly there is nothing.
Sometime around the year 1700 BC, when the last kings of Ur were already a distant memory, somewhere on the other side of the world, on a small rocky island on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, the last woolly mammoth to ever live on Earth lay down and died. Sumerian society, in its imperial form, rose, lived out its golden age, and died, outlived by the woolly mammoth.
Insane.
I want to end the episode with an excerpt from that great Sumerian poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This section relates an episode that I think is one of the most incredible sequences in any piece of ancient literature. It shows the king Gilgamesh weeping over the loss of his dying friend, and his friend reaches up to him and tells him that he has dreamed of the afterlife, that he has seen what awaits him after death. This passage is a melancholy meditation on loss. It shows all the kings of the earth who have ever ruled, living on in this dark and silent place, their crowns put away forever. As you listen, imagine what it would have felt like to live in the great cities of Ur and Uruk, watching the twilight begin to fall over the Sumerian age. Imagine what it would feel like to see the crops grow weaker every year, as the white crust of salt begins to form on the ground, and the city's people go hungry in the streets, wailing year after year for the gods to help them. Imagine how it would have felt to see the armies of the mountain people gathering on the horizon, having to flee the city with your possessions on your back, leaving your home behind forever, as the wind rustles through the dying reeds, and the chanting of the priests still goes on in the ziggurat's tall tower as the sun begins to set over the desert.
Listen, my friend. This is the dream I dreamed last night. I stood before an awful being, the somber-faced man-bird. He turned his stare towards me and he led me away to the palace of Akala, the Queen of Darkness, to the house from which none who enters ever returns, down the road from which there is no coming back. There is the house whose people sit in darkness. Dust is their food and clay their meat. They are clothed like birds with wings for covering. They see no light. They sit in darkness. I entered the house of dust, and I saw the kings of the earth, their crowns put away forever, rulers and princes, all who once wore kingly crowns and ruled the world in the days of old. They who had stood in the place of the gods stood now like servants. In the house of dust were high priests and acolytes, priests of the incantation and of ecstasy. And there was Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, she who keeps the books of the dead. She raised her head. She saw me and spoke. Who has brought this one here? Then I awoke, like a man drained of blood, who wanders alone in a waste.
Thank you once again for listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. I'd like to thank my voice actors for this episode, Ree Brignall, Jake Barrett-Mills, Shem Jacobs, Nick Bradley, and Emily Johnson. I love to hear your thoughts and responses on Twitter, so please come and tell me what you thought. You can follow me at Paul MM Cooper. And if you'd like updates about the podcast, announcements about new episodes, as well as images, maps, and reading suggestions, you can follow the podcast at Fall of Civ Pod, with underscores separating.
Oh my gosh.
In the year 1812, a Swiss explorer and eccentric named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was traveling in the Middle East, in the region of what is today Jordan. Burckhardt was a strange and colourful character. Born on the shores of Lake Geneva, he had travelled to England to study, and there had been employed by a group known as the African Association, a gathering of upper-class Englishmen who financed expeditions of exploration. They had given Burckhardt the task of crossing the Sahara Desert from Cairo and making contact with what was then considered a lost city, the city of Timbuktu. Burckhardt took his assignment seriously, and he threw himself into it with all the energy of a true Georgian eccentric. He began to study Arabic at Cambridge University, and while there he began dressing in traditional Arab clothing, wearing long white dish dashers and a turban, much to the bemusement of his fellow students. After graduating, he moved to Syria and spent 2 years there practicing his Arabic, even adopting the name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah and attempting to pass himself off as a Muslim. It's not clear how successful Burckhardt's disguise really was, or whether anyone in the Arab world was fooled. In preparation for his great journey, he set out on a number of expeditions into the Syrian desert, but many of these ended in disaster. He was robbed on a number of occasions, often by the same people he had hired to act as security on the journey, but his desire for adventure was unabated by these setbacks. And in 1812, he set out on the journey from Syria to Cairo, with the intention there of securing passage across the great sandy sea of the Sahara. It was on this journey, taking the more dangerous inland route through the baking summer heat of the desert, that Burckhardt would make quite a different discovery. It was here that his guides told him of a series of mysterious ruins hidden in a narrow valley nearby, which was known by locals as Wadi Musa, or the Valley of Moses. At this point, Burckhardt was still in disguise as an Arab, and he contrived an excuse to visit the ruins, as he writes in his diary.
August 22nd, 1812. I was particularly desirous of visiting Moses' Valley, the antiquities of which I had heard the country people speak in terms of great admiration. I hired a guide at LG to conduct me there, and paid him with a pair of old horseshoes. He carried the goat and gave me a skin of water to carry, as he knew that there was no water in the valley below.
As Burkhard travelled with his guide down into the dry valley, he began to feel increasingly fearful that someone would see through his disguise, and his ruse would be discovered.
In following the rivulet of LG westwards, the valley soon narrows again, and it is here that the antiquities of Wadi Musa begin. Of these, I regret I am not able to give a very complete account, but I knew well the character of the people around me. I was without protection in the midst of a desert where no traveller had ever before been seen, and a close examination of these works of the infidels, as they are called, would have excited suspicions that I was a magician in search of treasures. Future travellers may visit the spot under the protection of an armed force, and the antiquities of Wadi Musa will then be found to rank amongst the most curious remains of ancient art.
Burkhardt's guides led him towards what, from a distance, appeared to be a sheer cliff of brilliant red sandstone. But as he drew closer, he saw a well-concealed ravine opening up in the stone wall, from which a sparse stream was flowing.
The valley seemed to be entirely closed by high rocks, but upon a nearer approach, I perceived a chasm about 15 or 20 feet in breadth, through which the rivulet flows westward in winter. The precipices on either side of the torrent are about 80 feet in height. In many places, the opening between them at the top is less than at the bottom, and the sky is not visible from below.
As Burkhard travelled down this shady chasm, his sense of excitement gradually grew to wonder as he came upon the sight of an enormous tomb carved into the very rock of the red sandstone mass around him.
In continuing along the winding passage, an excavated mausoleum came in view, the situation and beauty of which are calculated to make an extraordinary impression upon the traveller. After having traversed for nearly half an hour such a gloomy and almost subterraneous passage as I have described, the natives call this monument Kostra Faroum, or Pharaoh's Castle, and pretend that it was the residence of a prince. But it was rather the sepulchre of a prince, and great must have been the opulence of a city which could dedicate such monuments to the memory of its rulers.
It's clear that the sight of this hidden wonder had an enormous effect on Burkhard, and he writes breathlessly in his diary about the sight of this enormous edifice.
It is one of the most elegant remains of antiquity existing in Syria. Its state of preservation resembles that of a building recently finished, and on closer examination, I found it to be a work of immense labor. The colonnade is about 35 feet high, and the columns are about 3 feet in diameter with Corinthian capitals. The colonnade is crowned with a pediment, which consisted of an insulated cylinder crowned with a vase, standing between two other structures in the shape of small temples, supported by short pillars. The entire front, from the base of the columns to the top of the ornaments, may be 60 or 65 feet.
Johann Burkhard would be the first European in modern times to set foot in a city that for much of the previous millennium had been only a legend. This was the ancient city of Petra. For centuries, it had been the heart of a powerful trading kingdom that controlled the flow of spice and incense coming across the desert from the lands of the east. Its people had built vast constructions, carved with immaculate skill into the sandstone bedrock of the desert itself, and tamed one of the harshest environments to be found on planet Earth. They had fought and traded with empires, and played a starring role in many of the historical dramas of their age. They were called the Nabateans. As Burckhardt wandered through the gullies and chasms of that lost city, he must have wondered how such a society had flourished out here in the harsh landscape of the Arabian desert. And if so great a civilization had arisen here, what had happened to empty its temples and streets and leave it to be buried in the wandering sands of the desert? My name's Paul Cooper, and you're listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. Each episode, I look at a civilization of the past that rose to glory and then collapsed into the ashes of history. I want to ask, what did they have in common? What led to their fall? And what did it feel like to be a person alive at the time who witnessed the end of their world? In this episode, I want to look at one of the most remarkable stories of civilizational survival to come down to us from the ancient world, the story of the trading empire of the Nabateans. I want to explore how these once humble traders rose to become masters of the desert sands and to defy empires. I want to show how the city of Petra flourished to become the crossroads of the world. And I want to explore what happened to finally bring down the empire of Nabatea. Sandstone is a sedimentary rock. It's formed when layers of sand are piled one upon another, and then over time subjected to enormous pressure. This pressure, along with natural mineral processes, fuses the sand grains together into rock. Beneath the lands of Jordan, where this historical drama will unfold, two great beds of sandstone stretch out. These are known as Disi sandstone and Ishrin sandstone. Disi sandstone is the youngest and uppermost layer. Sandstones can be any color, depending on the kinds of grains that went into forming it. And this kind is hard, pale grey, and usually erodes to form distinctive dome-like structures. But beneath this layer is a layer of older sandstone, at least 20 million years older. This is Ishrin sandstone, and it's easily recognizable by the beautiful patterns it forms. And due to its composition of iron, hydroxides, and manganese oxides, it is famous for its color, woven with rich oranges, purples, and deep rosy reds. The winding, interlaced patterns on these stones were formed by the shapes of riverbeds that ran across this landscape as much as 500 million years ago, in the middle of the period known as the Cambrian. During this period, the planet Earth would have looked like a very alien place, almost like the surface of another planet. There were a few plants like mosses and lichens, but no leaves or trees, and no animals on the bare, rocky land. The sea levels were high, with little or no polar ice, and so large areas of the continents were flooded with warm, shallow seas, filled with some of the largest forms of life to yet have evolved, crustaceans and arthropods like trilobites. Over the hundreds of millions of years that followed, an enormous amount of sand was deposited on the floors of these oceans, as their waves ground away at the rocks of the planet crust, as rainwaters flowed down through rivers, bringing silt and dust along with them. Today, the Ishrin layer of sandstone is more than half a kilometer thick, and in most places it is buried by sheets of younger grey limestone. This rosy sandstone would have remained buried if it weren't for the unique plate tectonics of the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian plate is currently being crushed by the other plates around it, the much larger African and Eurasian plates. It's being pushed north at a rate of 15 millimeters a year, or about as fast as your fingernails grow. As it does so, these enormous forces have thrown up mountain ranges in Turkey, Syria, and Iran. And this vice-like pressure has caused the landmass to tilt. All of the rock layers in Jordan now slope gently towards the northeast. The upper limestone layer became exposed to the powerful forces of the wind and sand. In places like Wadi Rum, Danar, the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, and at the site of Petra, these grey sandstones eroded away, and the long-buried layers of Ishrin sandstone came into view in all their rich red glory. And it's here, in this landscape of rosy red stone, that the story of the Nabateans would begin. The earliest hints of a people who may have been the Nabateans comes from the sources of the late kings of Assyria in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Like many rulers of this region before them, they had struggled to control the nomadic tribal peoples living in the deserts to their south. The 7th century BC Assyrian king Sennacherib wrote the following inscription detailing one of his campaigns in the south.
In my first campaign, I accomplished the defeat of Merodach Baladan, king of Babylonia, together with the army of Elam, his ally, in the plain of Kish. On my return march, the Tamuna, the Yabudu, the Damanu, the Nabatu, who were not submissive at all of them I conquered.
Sennacherib's grandson, the king Ashurbanipal, also wrote of encountering these desert peoples.
The Nabatu live in a far-off desert place where there are no wild animals, and not even birds build their nests.
Today, many scholars dismiss the similarities between the name of the ancient Nabatu and the later Nabateans as a simple coincidence. But what we do know is that since the earliest history of this region, people have lived in this kind of nomadic manner in the deserts of Arabia. These people would have no fixed towns or cities, no houses or temples, but they would move with their herds, constructing tents wherever they went, and moving as restlessly as the desert sands. They would survive by raising animals like goats, sheep, and cows, which could provide meat, milk, and wool. They would forage and hunt what they could from the environment, and would perhaps plant orchards that they would return to each year on their wandering routes. It seems that during their early history, the Nabateans would also act as pirates and bandits, using their knowledge of the desert to outmaneuver the slow-moving trade caravans that passed through their territory and along their coast. The 1st century Roman writer Strabo recounts that the Nabateans even dabbled in sea-borne piracy.
Nabatea is a country with a large population and well supplied with pasturage. They also dwell on islands situated off the coast nearby, and these Nabateans formerly lived a peaceful life. But later, by means of rafts, went to plundering the vessels of people sailing from Egypt. But they paid the penalty when a fleet went over and sacked their country.
Soon it seems that the Nabateans discovered that it was more profitable not to rob the trade caravans, but to offer them protection to pass through their territory for a price. And from there, it was only one small step to organizing the caravans themselves. By the end of the first millennium BC, the Nabateans had pushed out their rivals and now dominated the business of transporting goods across the deserts of Arabia. By the time the first books of the Hebrew Bible were being written down, it's clear that the Arab kingdoms of the south were already making a killing. In the Book of Kings 10:15, the following account is made of the wealth of the 10th century King Solomon, with particular mention of the wealth of the Arab kingdoms.
Now, the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Beside that, he had of the merchantmen, and of the traffic of the spice merchants, and of all the kings of Arabia, and of the governors of the country.
The first truly solid account of the Nabateans comes second-hand, from around the year 312 BC, and the Greek writer known as Hieronymus of Cardia. Hieronymus wrote an apparently detailed description of the Nabatean people, expounding on their history, their culture, and their way of life. But unfortunately for us, that text hasn't survived into the modern day. But he was used as a major source for other later scholars, like the Greek historian Diodorus of Sicily, writing more than 300 years later. In his work, Diodorus gives
nice
a
that you're still here, my man. I
description
appreciate it. I
of
had
the
lunch
Nabateans
and everything.
based
Thanks, bro.
on the earlier observations of Hieronymus of Cardia. He paints a picture of an uncompromising nomadic people who refused the comforts of settled society out of a desire for independence.
For the sake of those who do not know, it will be useful to state in some detail the customs of these Arabs, by following which it is believed they preserve their liberty. They range over a country that is partly desert and partly waterless, though a small section of it is fruitful. They live in the open air, claiming as native land a wilderness that has neither rivers nor abundant springs from which it is possible for a hostile army to obtain water. It is their custom neither to plant grain, set out any fruit-bearing tree, use wine, nor construct any house. And if anyone is found acting contrary to this, death is his penalty. They follow this custom because they believe that those who possess these things are, in order to retain the use of them, easily compelled by the powerful to do their bidding.
Diodorus also recounts the great wealth that the Nabateans had amassed due to their control of crucial trade routes for spices and incense.
Some of them raise their camels, others sheep, pasturing them in the desert. While there are many Arab tribes who use the desert as pasture, the Nabateans far surpass the others in wealth, although they are not much more than 10,000 in number, for not a few of them are accustomed to bring down to the sea frankincense and myrrh, and the most valuable kinds of spices which they procure from those who convey them.
Frankincense and myrrh are the resins of two different plants in the Burseraceae family, gnarled and stunted trees that grow on the Arabian Peninsula, in India and North Africa. When the bark of these trees is damaged, they have evolved to release resin from their wounds, which forms a glassy seal, protecting the plant's delicate insides from further harm. But trees are also susceptible to bacterial infections, just like we are. And as an extra line of defense, these resins are filled with volatile compounds that kill bacteria and fungi, similar to our own immune system. It's these volatile chemicals that also act in interesting ways on the human sense of smell. And for at least the last 5,000 years, These resins have been used for
That's
their
no way. I'm
antibacterial
sorry, man.
properties
I'm sorry.
in
Thanks,
medicine,
man.
and for their striking
Thanks, man.
aromas when burned. Frankincense releases a sweet and woody scent with notes of
I'm gonna
lemon,
play for maybe,
while myrrh
I don't know,
releases
another
a
half
smell
hour
that
or
is
so,
more
and then
like
I gotta go
spice,
after.
bitterer, with floral overtones. At harvest times, farmers slice gashes into the barks of the trees and collect the milky resins that ooze from within. Once
Shoot for another half hour.
exposed to air and sun, myrrh dries and hardens to reddish-brown, pea-sized chunks, while frankincense dries to pale
Thank you
yellow,
for the anonymous gift sub,
droplets.
Dogger Legend.
Diodorus of
Thank you,
Sicily
anonymous.
even claims that the smells were so strong that sailors traveling up the coast of Arabia could smell them as they sailed past. A group of Greek sailors who ran out of supplies on the Arabian coast around the year 300 AD landed on the shore in search of water and stumbled upon a plantation of these trees. They were later interviewed by the botanist Theophrastus, who wrote down everything they told him about the methods of extracting these resins.
They said that on the coasting voyage they landed to look for water on the mountains and saw these trees and the manner of collecting their gums. They reported that with both trees incisions had been made, both in the stems and in the branches. Also that in some cases the gum was dropping, but that in others it remained sticky to the tree, and that in some places mats woven of palm leaves were put underneath, while that which remained sticky to the trees they scraped off with iron tools.
The cultivation of these trees was veiled in secrecy, and this secrecy gave rise to outlandish myths. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, recorded the process for harvesting these incenses, along with an account of a supposed race of monsters that guarded them.
Arabia is the furthest of the inhabited lands in the direction of the midday, and in it alone of all lands grow frankincense and myrrh. These are got with difficulty by the Arabians, for these trees which produce frankincense are guarded by winged serpents, small in size and of various colors, which watch in great numbers about each tree, and they cannot be driven away from the trees by any other thing, but only the smoke.
Alright, Nightmate, good luck with
that.
Oh, thanks, Moonraker. Appreciate it, man. Thanks, buddy.
We will never
Thank you,
know
man.
whether this was a simple legend,
I will
or
need
whether it was a purposeful piece of disinformation spread by Arab frankincense farmers to scare others away from their lucrative industry. If this latter was the case, then it seems to have worked.
Oh,
The
that one
stories
bullet.
of venomous
Oh, come
flying
on.
snakes were repeated by a number of other ancient Greek writers.
Having good runs,
And
having good
few
runs.
of those who explored the coast of Arabia by sea were ever brave enough to venture inland to see the incense plantations for themselves. And it's not hard to see why these commodities were so sought after. Towns and cities of the Bronze and Iron Age would likely have been a potent mix of pungent smells. Even in the most refined cities, sanitation was in its early stages, if it existed at all, and little centralized planning would often mean that waste would build up close to where people lived and worked. With no refrigeration, food would spoil quickly, and industries like leather tanning used dung and urine to produce their products. All of this would have combined to create a heady assault on the noses of all the people who lived there. And for the rich, alleviating this discomfort was something they were willing to pay for. Aside from this obvious use, the burning of incense also took on a significant spiritual dimension. Temples and places of religious worship wanted to create a clear divide between the inside of the temple, a holy, sacred space, and the dirty, smelly world outside. And incense was one of the best ways to do this. Since ancient times, people had noticed
incense
the
was to
connection
hide all
between
the smelly
bad
people?
smells and
It's hilarious.
illness and death. Our
Makes
sense
sense.
of smell evolved in part to protect us from harmful bacteria in waste and decaying matter. And so naturally, people noticed that those who lived close to foul-smelling places, like sewers and waste heaps, would get sick more often and even die. Since the earliest texts have been recorded, it's clear that people considered the presence of bad smells to be evidence of the existence of evil spirits, invisible to the eye but lingering in the air, waiting to cause disease and misery to the people around them. A large part of the responsibility of a temple was to give people comfort from the daily horrors of disease and misfortune. And to do this, they would need to create a space where these putrid smells and the evil associated with them were not allowed entry. This use of incense to create a sense of holy space is truly ancient. It was mentioned as part of rituals in Homer's Odyssey, and the book of Exodus even describes a particular blend of frankincense and other spices to be ground and burnt in the sacred altar before the Ark of the Covenant, and even goes so far as to forbid its use for any other purpose.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take fragrant spices, gum resin, onycha and galbanum, and pure frankincense, all in equal amounts, and make a fragrant blend of incense, the work of a perfumer. It is to be salted and pure and sacred. Grind some of it to a powder and place it in front of the Ark of the Covenant law in the tent of meeting. It shall be most holy to you. Do not make any incense with this formula for yourselves. Whoever makes incense like it to enjoy its fragrance must be cut off from their people."
From this connection to the divine, incense would soon become integral to the function of royalty. Myrrh was used in the anointing rituals of Hebrew queens and in the embalming process for the mummies of Egyptian pharaohs. In the Christian New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew describes a group of wise men who travel from the east to attend the birth of Jesus and who bring him the traditional offerings given to royalty: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, gifts designed to reinforce his claim to being born as King of the Jews and the descendant of King David. In other words, incense around this time was serious business. These fragrances were not simply frivolous luxuries, but they were essential tools in the way that religious authority and the power of the state were constructed. As societies became more centralized and these institutions grew in power and wealth, the demand for incense would only increase. As the 2nd and 1st centuries BC passed by, the Nabatean people found themselves at the very heart of this crucial industry. Camels would soon lumber across the Nabatean roads with boxes of frankincense and myrrh from Oman, sacks of spices from India, and bolts of cloth from Syria, as well as sugar and ivory from Africa.
Anonymous gifts
And all of
of
this
legend.
would pass through a city that sat at the crossroads of multiple trade routes. A place that would come to hold a semi-mythical reputation around the known world. To the Nabateans, this city was known as Raqqa, but to the people of the wider world, it would come to be known by the Greek word for rock, the element from which it was carved. This was the city of Petra. The site of Petra has been inhabited for at least the last 7,000 years, and this is partly due to its interesting geology. A freshwater spring rises from the ground here, known as Musa's Spring, and it's held in traditional beliefs to be the place where the biblical figure Moses once struck a rock with his staff and caused water to gush from the desert stones. And the appearance of a spring of water in this arid desert really must have seemed miraculous to the early peoples who settled here. As rainwaters permeate through these porous sandstones, they gather in subterranean pools, and these waters slowly leach out of the rocks along the paths of least resistance. This means that the very stones of Petra's landscape act like enormous water towers, slowly releasing their stores of water through the long dry months of the Arabian summer. Over millions of years, these spring waters, along with the brief but heavy winter rains, have cut through the sandstone bluffs so that a narrow ravine known as a seek wound its way through the solid stone. Beyond this was a perfectly enclosed area, sheltered by high cliffs from the desert wind and sands, and with a constant supply of fresh water. The 1st century Roman author and naturalist Pliny the Elder gives one early account of the city in his work, Natural History.
The Nabateans inhabit a town named Petra. It lies in a deep valley, in little less than 2 miles wide, and is surrounded by inaccessible
They have all these
mountains
writings.
with a river flowing between.
They have all these Sumerian Nabatean writings explaining it. It's crazy.
Its distance from the town of Gaza on the Mediterranean coast is 600 miles, and from the Persian Gulf is 635 miles.
This naturally occurring spring water was enough to support a small population, but as the city's importance grew and the trade caravans got larger, the strain on its supply must have grown and grown. To enhance the natural water systems of the region, the Nabateans began to build complex water control systems, cutting aqueducts into the sandstone of the mountains, and even building underground plumbing systems out of terracotta pipes to divert the water of several nearby springs directly into the heart of the settlement. And they also learned techniques for gathering rainfall that they used to enormous effect. Although the climate of the region wasn't quite as arid 2,000 years ago as it is today, this landscape was still a desert. Rain in these parts came extremely rarely, and the so-called rainy season, around January, could consist of just 1 or 2 spells of rain in a year. In the height of summer, rainfall stops entirely. And so the Nabateans worked tirelessly to maximize the amount of water they could gather during these few rainy spells. Rainwater would naturally gather in depressions and hollows, and for centuries herdsmen had taken advantage of these natural pools. But sandstone is a porous rock, and the water would naturally drain away over time. To fix this problem, the Nabateans worked to line these natural pools with hard stucco plaster, meaning that the water would remain and could be used long into the season of drought. They built large dams across the valleys to gather rainwater into reservoirs and also reduce the flooding that occurred each year as rainwater followed the well-worn channels it had cut for millions of years through the red rock of the valley. The Nabateans' expert control of scarce water resources meant that Petra was able to grow to eventually house as many as 20,000 permanent residents, and to support the constant arrival of large trading caravans, many of them made up of hundreds of people and camels, arriving thirsty from the long desert roads. And soon the water was even abundant enough
that it could be used for more luxurious purposes. The citizens of Petra would soon be able to bathe, make wine, cultivate fruit, and stroll through their streets in the shade of palm trees. Archaeology shows that Petra was not just a city of tombs. In its time of flourishing, it was sprawling with lush gardens and pleasant fountains, enormous temples and luxurious villas. The Roman writer Strabo gives some glimpse of this.
The metropolis of the Nabateans is Petra, as it is called, for it lies on a site which is otherwise smooth and level, but it is fortified all round by a rock, the outside parts of the site being precipitous and sheer, and the inside parts having springs in abundance, both for domestic purposes and for watering gardens. Outside the circuit of the rock, most of the territory is desert, in particular towards Judea.
And some of the Nabateans' own inscriptions clearly reference gardens existing within the city. The following inscription from a tomb at Petra illustrates some of the flourishing plant life that once stood here, and which may have belonged to a temple. And its description stands in stark contrast to the barren sand and stones that today stretch out around it.
This tomb and the large burial chamber within it, and the small burial chamber beyond it, the enclosure in front of them and the porticos and the rooms within it, and the gardens and pleasure garden, and the walls of water and the cistern and walls, and all the rest of the property, which in these places are sacred and dedicated to Dushara, the god of our Lord, and his sacred throne, and all the gods.
Outside the city, in the surrounding countryside, water control was even more crucial. Even with enough water, the Nabateans still needed to eat. And to do so, they would employ a unique style of farming that maximized the potential of the difficult terrain. They would contour a large area of the land, digging it out into a shallow funnel, sloping down to a single point. And at this point, they would plant a single fruit tree. When the rains came, the water would drain down to this central point, and the tree could survive. To plant an orchard of trees using this method, you need about 50 times the normal space, but it was an effective technique. And out here in the desert, one thing the Nabateans had no shortage of was space. The Nabateans also used their expertise at water control to enormous strategic advantage. Diodorus of Sicily recounts how they built a system of secret, hidden reservoirs across the desert, meaning that only they could take advantage of them, ensuring that no competitors could move in on their lucrative trade routes. And in times of war, their secret reservoirs also gave them an advantage against their enemies, as Diodorus recalls.
They are exceptionally fond of freedom, and whenever a strong force of enemies comes near, they take refuge in the desert, using this as a fortress, for it lacks water and cannot be crossed by others, but to them alone. Since they have prepared subterranean reservoirs lined with stucco, the mouths of which they make very small. After filling these reservoirs with rainwater, they close the openings, making them even with the rest of the ground, and they leave signs that are known to themselves but are unrecognizable by others. They water their cattle every other day, so that if they flee through waterless places, they may not need a continuous supply of water.
But despite the immense difficulties of maintaining this city, its position meant it was all worth it. That's because Petra sat at the center of a spider's web of trade routes, spreading off in every direction. To the east, desert roads led to the port towns of Basra and Dhahran in the Persian Gulf, where spices from East Asia, like cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and pepper, flowed, as well as precious stones from India and fine silks from China.
It's too slow, man.
From the south, frankincense and myrrh poured into Petra from the incense fields of Yemen and Oman. Petra connected the nearby Red Sea port of Aqaba with the Mediterranean port town of Gaza, connecting the markets of Eastern Africa with those of Europe. And on the roads to the north lay the great cities of Damascus and Antioch. To the west, the roads led from Petra into Egypt, where tin was in constant demand, brought from Afghanistan, along with the brilliant blue stone lapis lazuli. The black volcanic glass obsidian was brought from Abyssinia. Perfumes and scented oils, as well as cosmetic powders and eyeshadows, flowed north to Greece, stored in containers carved from giant clamshells harvested in the Red Sea. The tarry substance bitumen was farmed from the Dead Sea and brought south to Egypt to help in the embalming process for mummies and to waterproof the hulls of ships. The Nabateans were so crucial to the transferring of all of these goods by land and sea that they were able to charge a tax equal to a full quarter of all the goods that passed through their lands. As a result, the Nabateans would soon grow fabulously, even absurdly wealthy. But soon others would start to look with jealous eyes to the fortune they had made.
Hi, my love. How are you, gorgeous?
The Nabateans were not a warrior people, and it seems that they preferred, wherever possible, not to fight. But they were more than capable of defending themselves when attacked, as one colourful episode from their history shows. The society of the Nabateans rose into a world that still bore the marks of one of history's most dramatic reshufflings of power. Towards the end of the 4th century BC, the 20-year-old King Alexander of the mountainous kingdom of Macedon in northern Greece had embarked on a 10-year campaign that would see him topple the Persian Empire and sweep eastwards to capture vast swathes of territory throughout Central Asia, even invading India. Alexander died in the year 323 BC in the city of Babylon, and his empire immediately disintegrated. He left in his wake a series of large Greek kingdoms stretching from Pakistan to Egypt, and each of these began fighting with one another over who would rule the remnants of the empire. One of these kingdoms was ruled by a king Antigonus, who had been a general under Alexander and who had served him as governor of much of the Middle East. Antigonus had lost an eye after apparently being struck by shrapnel from a splintering catapult bolt while serving under Alexander's father, and so he has gone down in history by the name Antigonus Monoophthalmos, or Antigonus the One-Eyed. Antigonus was also monomaniacal. He soon embarked on a determined campaign to reunite Alexander's great empire and rule over it himself. He quickly swept through Syria, taking the lands of his rivals, and conquered down the Mediterranean coast, eventually reaching the borders of the wealthy lands of the Nabateans. War is an expensive business, and as with most warmongers, Antigonus was permanently short of money. Soon he began to look hungrily to the south, and dreamed of seizing the fabled wealth of Petra for himself. In the year 312 BC, he ordered one of his generals, a man named Athenius, to march into the desert and seize as much as he could of the wealth of these Nabatean traders. The disciplined and battle-hardened phalanxes of Antigonus were among the best soldiers in the world, some having served under Alexander himself, and these crack troops don't seem to have expected much of a challenge. Athenius marched out into the desert from Judea with an army made up of 4,000 foot soldiers, armed with long pikes, and 600 horsemen, as Diodorus of Sicily recounts.
Deciding that this people was hostile to his interests, he selected one of his friends, Athenius, and gave him 4,000 light foot soldiers and 600 horsemen fitted for speed, and ordered him to set upon the barbarians suddenly and cut off all their cattle as plunder.
It took Athenius and his soldiers 3 days to travel the 160 kilometers across the desert, but soon they came into view of the legendary stone city. Athenius ordered his men to prepare for a nighttime attack. We can imagine the sight of the Greek army waiting and watching as the shadows stretched long over the rosy stones of the city and the sun set in a purply haze over the Jordanian desert. When night fell, the soldiers stormed into the city. They found it almost completely undefended. There seems to have been no permanent garrison guarding the city of Petra, and the Nabatean men were away on business. What followed was a frenzy of looting, and here we can get a sense for the vast wealth that had been amassed in this city. Athenius and his men loaded themselves with as much frankincense and myrrh as their animals could carry, and reportedly made away with nearly 14 tons of silver. Not content with that, they also rounded up all of the women and children they could and abducted them with the intention of selling them as slaves, as Diodorus recalls.
Of those that were caught there, some he slew at once, some he took as prisoners, and others who were wounded he left behind. And of the frankincense and myrrh he gathered together the larger part, and about 500 talents of silver.
The Greeks, hardly believing how easy it had been, marched off with their slaves and loot as fast as they could, and made their way back along the road to safety, weighed down with treasure and prisoners, and with their horses no doubt struggling in the desert landscape. They travelled about 36 kilometers from Petra and thought that there would be safe to make camp. But they had not reckoned on the camel-powered armies of the Nabateans. Only a few hours after Athenius and his soldiers had left Petra, the first Nabatean men began to return to the city. Finding its houses and temples looted and their wives and children gone, they heard about the Greek attack from wounded survivors and began an immediate pursuit. They sent out riders and gathered more men from every village they passed through, until the Nabatean force had swollen to a horde of 8,000 camel riders. They loped across the desert with exceptional speed, easily outpacing Greek horses, and caught up to Athenius' camp by nightfall.
While the men of Athenius were encamped with little thought of the enemy, and because of their weariness were in deep sleep, some of their prisoners escaped secretly, and the Nabateans, learning from them the condition of the enemy, attacked the camp at about the third watch, being no less than 8,000 in number.
Under cover of darkness, the enraged Nabateans swept into the Greek camp and slaughtered everyone they could find.
Most of the hostile troops they slaughtered where they lay. The rest they slew with their javelins as they awoke and sprang to arms. In the end, all the foot soldiers were slain.
Gotta go.
But of the horsemen, about 50 escaped, and of these the larger part were wounded. When the Nabateans had managed
Gotta go now. I'm gonna do one more run, just an ender run, but I gotta go. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Going outside. It's a sunny day. There's no more smoke.
Every single Greek foot
Life is
soldier
great.
was killed, and only about 50 of the Greek cavalry were able to flee.
Thanks for
the
being
sea
here. Thank you
and
so much,
trickle
Anonymous,
back
for the sub
across
to
the
Dogger
desert.
the Legend.
For the Greeks, this was an incredible humiliation. But it's clear the Nabateans had no interest in fighting a war. They sent a message to King Antigonus in Aramaic, the common language of the ancient Middle East, explaining why they had wiped out his army and asking for no further aggression against them. The embarrassed Greek king clearly tried his best to save face.
To Antigonus they wrote a letter in Syrian characters in which they accused Athenius and vindicated themselves. Antigonus replied to them, agreeing that they had been justified in defending themselves. But he found fault with Athenius, saying that he made the attack contrary to the instructions he had been given. He did this, hiding his own intentions and desiring to delude the barbarians into a sense
It still wasn't
of
even that
security.
fast.
The Arabs were highly pleased because they seemed to have been relieved of great fears, yet they did not altogether trust the words of Antigonus. Regarding their prospects as uncertain, they placed watchmen upon the hills from which it was easy to see from a great distance the passes into Arabia.
This final act of caution seems to have been completely justified. In fact, King Antigonus had no intention of maintaining the peace, or accepting defeat at the hands of a people he considered to be barbaric.
Gotta go. Thanks for being here. Thank you
He
so much,
ordered
Anonymous,
his
to the
son,
sub.
Demetrius,
It's really awesome.
to march
It
back
really means a
into
lot.
the
It's really
Nabatean
cool.
lands and accomplish what
Is anybody
Athenius
reading or is
could
anybody
not.
streaming?
This time with another 4,000 foot soldiers and a much larger force of 4,000 cavalry. But Demetrius would not have much more success. The watchmen that the Nabateans had placed along their borders quickly spotted the advance of the Greeks and lit warning beacons on the hilltops. The desert people scattered their flocks, hiding them away in narrow crevices and hidden places, and took all of their precious goods, women and children, with them. They all fled to a stony fortress, possibly a flat-topped mountain named al-Biyada, the tallest point around the city of Petra.
Demetrius, on arriving at the rock and finding that the flocks had been removed, made repeated assaults upon the stronghold. Those within resisted stoutly, and easily had the upper hand because of the height of the place. And so on this day, after he had continued the struggle until evening, he recalled his soldiers by a trumpet call.
The Greek general Demetrius was clearly frustrated. The single, narrow approach up to the mountain stronghold made a direct attack on it virtually impossible, and it's clear that at least someone among the Nabateans had a gift with words. As Demetrius approached the next day for a fresh round of assaults, someone called down from the walls with the following impassioned plea.